Also want to just say, be on the lookout for an announcement of a similar partnership as we have with the UK with another leading European country. And we are not the first out of the gate for this offshore wind endeavor, but we have many, many people around the world who are interested in partnering with us to ensure our success. So we're looking forward to another very important announcement for the task force and commerce later this month. I won't mention who yet because I don't want to steal the thunder. They want to make a big production out of it. So but just know that we have others who are, other countries who are willing and ready to partner with us. I'm going to give her a chance to get seated, but I just noted that Secretary Sanders has joined us and if she would like to make any comments in the task force, put you on the spot, you are more than welcome.
I didn't even get seated.
Well, while she's getting settled, I will just say that Secretary Sanders and I just returned from a business development trip in Switzerland and Italy, where we had an opportunity to meet with a number of companies and trade associations, all eager and interested to do business with North Carolina, and perhaps you want to comment on that at all. Secretary Sanders, if you don't mind sharing the microphone, please. She's good with being put on the spot. She knows how to handle the pressure.
Okay. So much so that I'm speechless. Good morning to everyone, and thank you all for being here, and thank you for your continued contributions to what I believe will be a new and booming and great economy for North Carolina, and contribute to a problem and a much bigger economy than beyond the borders of North Carolina for sure. Yes, Deputy Secretary, calling you Deputy Secretary, Chief of Staff, Marquita Welton and I were part of a delegation in Italy and Switzerland, and clean energy, offshore wind, and a greener economy was at the forefront of the conversation, right there with workforce development and talent. And so we were pleased to have conversations about the governor's leadership in this space and what North Carolina is doing. And of course, Marquita was there and spoke about the work of Towers. And so there's an opportunity for us to collaborate. As you know, we have MOU with the UK, and I'm expecting that we will see more collaboration globally. And it's an opportunity for you to contribute and have an impact on all of our futures, as well as have a global impact. So thank you for your time, and thank you, Marquita, for your leadership and for continuing to lead us and guide us and represent us well, whether that's here or abroad. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you so much, Secretary Sanders. I will note, if you would please note on your calendars the airing of a segment on offshore wind, part of a panel along with a representative from Dominion Wind, and that show will air on March 24th. So a little more recognition for offshore wind in North Carolina, as well as the task force. Again, that's March 24th, NC Impact with hosting Brown. All right, we're moving a little ahead of schedule, which is great because it gives us more time for the robust conversation we're anticipating later. We're going to go ahead and ask Jennifer if she would come and present her report as the Assistant Secretary for Clean Energy.
Technology.
Oh, and before you get started, I will say that we are having some technical difficulties with our streaming platform. The meeting, though, is being recorded and will be made available later on our website. So we apologize to those who wanted to join us remotely but are unable to do so.
I think technology is clear. Grateful for that. Thank you, Alan and Patrice and all my colleagues from the department who keep the wheels turning and the trains running on time. I appreciate that very much. Good morning, everybody. It's so great to see y'all here again, well, here in Raleigh for the first time, but it's great to bring this august group together again and talk about our favorite topic, offshore wind. I'm Jennifer Mundt, Assistant Secretary for Clean Energy Economic Development, and tasked with what has turned out to become my regular position on the agenda with a quick update on all the things that have happened since we met last.
Jennifer, if I may ask you to pull the microphone up a little bit to make sure that it's being picked up on the recording.
Okay, is that better? I can lean, I can lurch. Okay, so a lot has happened since we last connected in Morehead City in November. Marquita and Secretary Sanders have already mentioned that we were accompanied by that expert delegation of 12 folks from the UK who brought with them a host of talent and expertise and their experience on offshore wind and shared that with us at our meeting. And as Marquita noted, Chair Welton noted, we have continued to foster and build upon those relationships, and I think there's just a lot to be gleaned from what they've shared with us. Also, since November, we had an election here in North Carolina with all 170 seats of our General Assembly were up for grabs. And if you were watching, like I think everybody else was, there was a change in leadership in our U.S. House of Representatives in D.C. Also, since November, a little closer to home, we hosted our second roundtable on offshore wind. We began distribution of our newsletter, and if y'all have not received it, raise your hand, Gina. Speak with Gina today, and she'll make sure that you're added to the distribution list. And we are planning an open house in Brunswick County for late in March, and additional details will be forthcoming. And also, since we met last, we've celebrated some holidays. We weathered single-degree temperatures. We've tracked a Chinese spy balloon, and 2023 is really off to a great start. So, with that said, this is just a quick preview of what I'm going to talk about, and since we're running well ahead of schedule, I won't talk as fast as I usually do. So, now that you have that memorized, oh, and I should note, you all have a copy of the slide deck in your folders if you want to take notes alongside what I say. We'll just start right here at the top. And we'll start with federal activities and then shift into what's been happening in the state. So, y'all might recall, and I provided an update about this in previous meetings, last March, the National Renewable Energy Laboratories released its, quote, Demand for a Domestic Offshore Wind Supply Chain Report, in which they reported that meeting the 30 gigawatts by 2030 goal established by President Biden will require 2,100 wind turbines, 6,800 miles of cabling, thousands of components, hundreds of vessels of different sizes and types and capacity or capability, and tens of thousands of people to do the work. On January 31st, the NREL released its follow-up report, a supply chain roadmap for offshore wind energy in the United States. This roadmap identifies short, mid, and long-term actions that will be necessary to meet the 30 by 30 goal. The report outlines several challenges that face the offshore wind industry sector, including uncertainty surrounding things like construction delays and changes in government leadership, limited availability and suitability of ports for manufacturing and marshaling activities, the limited number of installation and worker transport vessels, and on and on and on. But as my colleague and our friend John Hardin will describe in more detail later on, I think that these challenges represent specific and tangible opportunities for North Carolina. And if we're strategic and thoughtful and intentional, we can turn those challenges into opportunities and seize the future growth of the sector for the state. An update on the White House Federal State Offshore Wind Implementation Partnership. If y'all will recall, North Carolina is a member, along with 10 other East Coast states, participating in this White House-led initiative. Since last fall, several of us in the administration have been participating in a working group for supply chain. And this working group has been tasked with establishing a common framework to build out the domestic offshore wind supply chain. Overall, this small cohort is, we're approaching this regional collaboration as advantageous for the sector overall, as states can benefit from each other's manufacturing strengths and build a sustainable supply chain network. Regional collaboration is also viewed by project developers as a benefit in that they can invest in regional infrastructure to balance demand across multiple locations. While conceptually this sounds very logical, the agreed upon framework amongst the states needs to be flexible enough to respect the existing policies and programs in the participating states. So this group is presently reviewing and commenting on a proposed framework that defines quote-unquote regions and mechanisms by which content, and whether that content means goods and materials, jobs, services, infrastructure, and research. We're evaluating those things from each state, and we're defining within what is within the region they would be counted as a benefit to the state procuring the offshore wind capacity. So as you can imagine, this work is not for the faint of heart and is requiring a ton of compromise and concessions from all the parties who are participating. We'll be reporting back as soon as there is something more refined to share. But this is a priority of the White House, and we are working quickly to try to achieve this goal. So also at the federal level, if y'all were not aware, there have been some changes in leadership at the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. On January 19th, BOEM's first director appointed under President Biden, Amanda Ledford, resigned her post. And under her leadership, I just want to note that BOEM leased the Carolina Long Bay wind energy area just weeks shy of when the now rescinded 10-year moratorium on offshore leasing would have taken place. And so we're very grateful for her efforts for North Carolina and for what she did to advance the sector over her tenure. And in her place is Liz Klein, who is now leading BOEM. Director Klein previously served as senior counselor to Interior Secretary Deb Haaland. She's an attorney specializing in clean energy, climate change, and environmental law, with experience serving now President Biden is the third presidential administration she has served in. Another less sexy update, I would say, is BOEM announced a notice of proposed rulemaking to modernize their renewable energy regulations. So according to BOEM's press release, the proposed regulations strive to modernize and streamline the overly complex and burdensome process for developing offshore renewable energy projects, helps to clarify ambiguous provisions and enhance compliance provisions in order to decrease costs, decrease uncertainty associated with deployment of offshore wind facilities. BOEM estimates that these proposed reforms will save developers approximately $1 billion over a 20-year period. The first Outer Continental Shelf regulations were promulgated in 2009 by the Minerals Management Service, which was the agency that was renamed as BOEM after the Deepwater Horizon disaster. And through this NOPR, BOEM intends, like I said, to modernize these regulations that by implementing reforms that the agency has identified through its own work and as those recommended by stakeholders as they have been commenting and basically employing these regulations since 2010. So we're here 13 years in, and there's been a lot of experience and a lot that can be learned from, and clearly a lot that can be reformed. I would just note that there is a 60-day comment period that is open right now, and anybody and everybody is welcome to read the 300-odd page proposed rules in the Federal Register and make comments to the Bureau, and those will be due by March 31st. We're getting closer to some state-related updates, so I promised those were coming. So In mid-November, Bowen took an unprecedented step by publishing draft wind energy areas for the Central Atlantic Planning Area. The goal that Bowen set out to achieve was to receive additional public comment and feedback before proceeding with the official area identification, which includes the preparation of an environmental assessment under NEPA and coordinating activities prior to evolving to the lease and ultimate auction, or the auction activities and the leasing of the areas. I would note that Bowen is not required to solicit, is only required to solicit public comment on wind energy areas once they are finalized, and not draft wind energy areas. And so this additional step was received with much appreciation from many stakeholders across the region, including those of us representing the state of North Carolina. The state commented, or the state provided comments on these proposed areas, and it's hard to see on the screen, but again, you all have copies of this slide deck in front of you, so you could probably see a little bit better. But what we did is we provided comments on the areas proposed, or the draft wind energy areas proposed within areas D and F that are located off of our coast. In our comments, we encouraged Bowen to prioritize leasing in areas with waters shallow enough to accommodate fixed bottom development, so that North Carolina has a continued viable pipeline of projects advancing towards our 8 gigawatts by 2040 goal. Further, the state encouraged Bowen to address interregional transmission planning and consider the development of a backbone transmission system that would mitigate the impacts of multiple points of interconnection on our shores. The state also provided new and additional feedback from the State Historic Preservation Office and the Office of State Archaeology and the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources, in addition to reiterating our previously filed comments submitted by the Department of Environmental Quality and the Wildlife Resources Commission. And lastly, we supported Bowen's efforts to complete its compatibility assessment with the Department of Defense and encouraged Bowen to continue and engage in regular communications with fisheries stakeholders. All right, now we're squarely in North Carolina status updates. So just a quick update on where we are with our leased wind energy areas off the coast. We're referring here now to the Kitty Hawk wind energy area. And unfortunately, Ashley McLeod, representing Avangrid, isn't here, but I hope I can make her proud in her stead. So I would just note, in terms of updates, Bowen initiated work on the draft environmental impact statement for the Kitty Hawk North portion of the lease area in the fall of 2021, and expects to release the draft EIS for public comment at the end of this calendar year, after which a final environmental impact statement will be published along with Bowen's record of decision delineating their preferred development alternative. Several other federal and state permits and authorizations are required, and when obtained, Avangrid will finally be able to proceed with construction. With respect to Carolina Long Bay, y'all will recall that Duke Energy Renewables Wind and Total Energies won the lease auction for the 2 areas in Carolina Long Bay. Bowen executed those leases in June of last year, and based on regulatory requirements, we anticipate that the 2 developers will be submitting site assessment plans by sometime this summer. And I welcome Duke and Mark, Mark and Jen to weigh in at any point if they have any updates that they have to share. And just as, this looks like a busy slide, but it's my best attempt at trying to illustrate to y'all exactly where all of these projects are in the overall development process. So on the far left, I've got an orange box delineating the Central Atlantic, or the Central Atlantic process. And as you can see, it really hasn't really gotten much beyond leaving the gate. We are in pre-area identification stage. Again, going with these draft wind energy areas, and once once they identify the areas definitively, we will enter the area identification phase, where they'll start with the NEPA process. Moving to the right, we have Carolina Long Bay, and we've moved that arrow delineating where they are on the timeline just a little bit, because when we last looked at this graphic, we were right at lease at the lease option, where you see the little gavel down at the bottom. Now we're kind of in the middle, heading towards site assessment plan submission. Moving further over to the right, you see Kitty Hawk South, which is the larger portion of the Kitty Hawk wind energy area. And they submitted their construction operations plan to BOEM last year. And I believe they are going back and forth with the agency, and BOEM has yet to determine that it is a complete application, but once it deems it complete, it will be released publicly, and thus will begin the NEPA process. Kitty Hawk North, North Carolina's leased project that is furthest along in the process. Like I mentioned before, we are waiting for the release of the draft EIS later this year, and then we'll move on down the timeline. So again, this just illustrates the length of time that accompanies developing these massive infrastructure projects. Other state-related activities. And so for those of y'all who were watching for white smoke to rise from the Dobbs building at the end of last year, you were rewarded on the afternoon of December 30th when the Utilities Commission released the carbon plan order as required by House Bill 951. Recall, House Bill 951 directed the Commission to work with Duke Energy to develop a carbon plan to reduce carbon emissions from the power sector by 70% by the end of this decade, and to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. Now, I'm not going to steal our friend Peter Ledford's thunder, as he's going to provide a much more detailed overview of the carbon plan here in a few minutes. But I do want to list the highlights as they pertain to offshore wind. First, in the order, the Commission plainly states that it, quote, supports offshore wind. Also, the plan directs Duke to evaluate the 3 wind energy areas that are held under lease off the coast, the 2 Carolina Long Bay leased areas and Kitty Hawk. Evaluate them and consider each before it pursues an acquisition of a leasehold. This evaluation, according to the Commission, is required to be submitted by September 1 of this year and must include best estimates of all relevant costs to acquire and develop an area and deliver energy to the point of interconnection. And finally, the carbon plan also authorizes Duke to proceed with near-term development activities that would be common to developing all 3 of the wind energy areas under evaluation, and that includes related onshore wind transmission infrastructure. Again, there's so much more to the carbon plan beyond the components that address offshore wind specifically, and I, like you all, will be looking forward to Peter's readout shortly. And finally, looking ahead, what's on the horizon? And so you all know, looking into a crystal ball, some items that you see are murky and fuzzy, and some are quite clear. So I'm going to start with, well, I'm going to go back and forth. So murky is the status of several pending applications that the state and several agencies and partners have put in for offshore-related funding opportunities from the federal government. At our meeting in November, I briefly described a proposal that we submitted along with a core team of personnel from UNC Charlotte's EPIC Center, ECU, ECSU, E4 Carolinas, Clemson University, and the South Carolina Research Authority. This application was to the National Science Foundation for Type 1 funding to establish what we have deemed, or what we call, and you all know we love our acronyms, Clean Engines Innovation Engine. And Clean Engine stands for Clean Energy to Generate Innovative New Economic Systems. Right, write that down. We expect to hear from NSF sometime this month regarding our application. Several applicants within North Carolina submitted concept papers to the U.S. Department of Energy's Wind Energy Technology Office last month to fund projects aimed at addressing key development challenges associated with offshore wind. we'll be notified whether we are invited to submit a full application based on our concept paper, hopefully soon, because the full applications are due March 15th. And there's a lot of work to be done between now and then if we're invited for the full. More clearly on the horizon are a couple offshore wind conferences that we want to make sure that you're aware of. DOE is hosting a virtual floating offshore wind shot summit in a few weeks. And a link to that is, once this goes up online, it'll be a hot link and you can just click right there and register yourself if you're interested. And in about 5 weeks, the Business Network for Offshore Wind will be hosting its 10th annual International Partnering Forum on Offshore Wind, which will be convening in Baltimore, where we're going to have a significant North Carolina and Smart Power presence, both on the convention floor and in meetings and convenings. Also pretty clear on our horizon is fully executing on the memorandum of understanding between the UK and the state as we strengthen our ties to transition both of our economies to clean energy. Together, we've been collaborating on one of the MOU's key activities, the best practice exchange, namely on offshore wind. And I won't remind y'all about all the wonderful work we've done with that 12-member delegation from the UK who visited with us, because it goes without saying. And then looking ahead, we'll see what happens with some of these things. We may see additional cross-border or global agreements announced. It is indeed likely that North Carolina will join 11 other states as a party to the recently established Regional Fisheries Compensation Consortium. This consortium is intended to advance and implement a consistent regional approach for the administration of financial compensation paid by developers to address effects of offshore wind energy development on commercial and for hire recreational fishing industries and individuals. And so they are deliberating on that framework right now, and I anticipate North Carolina will be a part of that regional, that'll be a now 11-state, North Carolina joins to be a 12-state framework. Also murky is the prospect for new federal legislation pertaining specifically to offshore wind. However, on Tuesday, Louisiana Senator Cassidy announced that he would once again file the RISE Act for consideration in this Congress. This act, for all intents and purposes, would amend existing law to allow for revenue and royalty sharing for states and coastal regions adjacent to renewable energy projects off the coast, a funding stream that right now is only available to Gulf Coast states adjacent to oil and gas projects off their coast. And finally, murkiest yet, is what's going to happen in the 2023 legislative session. And we're all watching that eagerly as they begin convening in earnest across the street. And so, really, on that note, I invite y'all to stay tuned, participate in this conversation with us here today, and reach out to any one of us, my Congress colleagues, or other staff and other agencies who help support our work, so we can help shed any light on any of these activities that we have ongoing. So, thank y'all. I'm happy to answer any questions that y'all might have.
Does anyone have any questions for Jennifer or comments on anything that she shared with us? That means you've done an excellent job laying on. Okay, thank you.
Anybody online have any questions? Sorry.
I don't see any. It's okay, I think.
Catherine?
Yeah, I just have one quick question. Is North Carolina planning to submit comments to BOEM on the modernization rule?
Maybe. We can talk about that offline. Okay. Any other questions? I'll be here all day.
I'll just comment. I don't know if I made it or not. I attended the last infrastructure subcommittee meeting, and I was talking with Dana about this earlier in the week, and it's just the person you had making the presentation about transmission from water to land was really very informative, and I got a tremendous amount out of that. So I just wanted to commend you all for bringing that in and hoping to educate us a little bit.
Thank you for saying that. I appreciate that, Susie. All right,
Any more questions or comments for Jennifer before she steps away?
like I said, I'll be here all day. You can catch me anytime.
All right,
Thanks for
thank
your
you,
time.
Jennifer. All right. So we're going to invite Peter Ledford. Peter is the Clean Energy Director for the Office of Governor Roy Cooper. He's going to give us a 2022 carbon plan update. Thank you for joining us, Peter.
Thank you for having me. So again, my name is Peter Ledford. I serve as Clean Energy Director for Governor Cooper. As Jennifer alluded to, we had a little decision made by the Utilities Commission at the end of the year last year. For those of y'all who don't know about the Utilities Commission, they are the regulatory agency that oversees utilities in the state of North Carolina. Everything from electricity utilities to water, natural gas, ferries, moving trucks, lots of things fall under their jurisdiction. So they oversee things like rates for electricity. You cannot change the rates that they charge you without permission from the Utilities Commission. They oversee generation expansion plans and various issues related to the grid and things like that. So House Bill 951 passed in 2021, directed the Utilities Commission to adopt a carbon plan by the end of 2022. They snuck in, I would challenge Jennifer that I would call it early evening on December 30th when they released the order at about 6:30 p.m., causing lawyers all across the state of North Carolina to jump into a 137-page document, trying to read that. I figured y'all did not want to read a 137-page document, so you have some excerpts in your packet that deal specifically with offshore wind. This was a very comprehensive order that dealt with everything from how many megawatts of a particular technology are going to be built to much bigger picture issues such as cost recovery by the utility and how this interacts with other sorts of proceedings before the Utilities Commission. If you've never read a Utilities Commission order, I'm a little jealous of you, but they're generally broken down into several different sections. It starts off with a procedural history and just background information. In this proceeding, that took about 40 pages just for the commission to recite all of that. Then they go into findings of fact. These are basically the conclusions that they made based on the evidence that was presented to them in the proceeding. They then have a section that really dives deeper into that, explaining the evidence, recounting it, what witness said what, and who was credible, who was not credible, all the things that support those findings of fact. Then there's a series of ordering paragraphs, which are telling the parties to the proceeding, thou shalt go do this, basically. And then you also sometimes have dissents or concurrences, just like you do in a judicial case. As I mentioned, there were a lot of issues at play in the Utilities Commission, in the carbon plan proceeding, excuse me. I'm going to focus mainly on the offshore wind aspects, but I think it's good to set sort of a broader stage as well. The Utilities Commission is directed to adopt plans that get us to first 2030 and then to 2050. But a lot can change in between now and even 2030. The Commission, instead of saying every single year for the next 28 years, here are how many megawatts of generation are going to be built, anything like that, the Commission decided to focus on the short term. Prices change, new technologies become viable, everything evolves in that manner. So the Commission really focused on, here are the actions that Duke needs to take over the next 2 to 4 years. We're going to be reevaluating the carbon plan every 2 years. It's designed to be an iterative process. At this point in time, we don't need to be dictating what's going to be built in 2035, what's going to be built in 2045. That's just too far out. There's pretty broad consensus that this was an appropriate way for the Commission to go about setting the generation portfolio. It's in line with what the commission has previously done in other generation planning proceedings. So it is pretty non-controversial that the commission decided to take this sort of approach. A couple of other things that are really legal in nature. The first was lawyers are lawyers. They're going to argue about what the words on the paper mean. And there are words on the paper in House Bill 951 that say you need to hit these carbon reduction scenarios or the carbon reduction requirements by 2030 unless or but. So lawyers being lawyers argued about whether there could be delays past 2030 to 2032 or 2034. One of those exceptions allowing a delay is for offshore wind, just because it takes so much time to get an offshore wind project through that flow chart that Jennifer shared a few minutes ago. The commission decided we don't need to address this now. We're going to deal with this closer to 2030. We're going to set a plan, generation plan that we think if these things are built in the next few years, it's at least going to put us on track to hit the 2030 goals. If we need to re-examine whether it's going to be 2030, 2032, we'll deal with that later. So it's a pretty skillful way of kicking the can, but it's also something that avoids controversy. Another thing that I think is worth flagging for offshore wind is House Bill 951 requires Duke to own assets, with the exception of certain solar facilities. This is something that, again, caused a significant amount of legal fees, because lawyers found a way that they could argue about differences between Duke owning an asset versus leased cost. Would a power purchase agreement be cheaper? What sort of joint venture sort of coming out here, guys? Corporate structures, what sort of partnerships could be done instead of Duke owning 100%. The commission found that it was pretty cut and dry. The law says what the law says, and that Duke should own everything except for some of the specific technologies that are called out in the bill, like utility scale solar and energy efficiency. So switching now to really what the commission said about offshore wind specifically. I think that the packets that y'all have, at least mine, was missing a couple of pages. So please bear with me and we can get you the full thing by email after it. But the front page is just so you know what you're looking at. The page number at the bottom of the next one should be 40. If it's not, bear with me as I try and explain it to you. The commission issued about 8 specific findings of fact on dealing with offshore wind. I think importantly, they acknowledge that offshore wind provides pretty significant complement to solar, just dealing with the different generation profiles. North Carolina already has significant solar development. Offshore wind is a very good way to complement the existing technologies that we have and how that's going to grow. They run through a number of facts that y'all are very familiar with. It takes a while to build an offshore wind facility. BOEM has been working on this for a while. We've got 3 different wind energy areas off our coast. A couple of things that are really worth pulling out here is Duke had proposed to spend $317 million specifically for offshore wind. About half of that, $155 million, was for them to acquire the Carolina Long Bay lease, basically to move it from Duke Energy Renewables Wind, which is a corporate subsidiary of Duke Energy Corporation that is not overseen by the Utilities Commission, to transfer that asset to Duke Energy Progress, which is another subsidiary of Duke Energy Corporation that is the power provider for folks living in basically from Raleigh East down to the coast. So that would be the entity that would own and operate the offshore wind facility. They also wanted to have the commission go ahead and authorize them to spend about $60 million on development activities for the lease area and then about $100 million on transmission. Obviously, we need to get the energy from the coast to the load centers in the middle of the state, like Raleigh and Charlotte. So this was a very explicit ask that the utility had made of the commission. So really want to highlight that for y'all so we can come back to it in a little bit, because if you move forward, starting on page 98, these are the evidence and conclusions that the commission relied on when it came to offshore wind. I said this was a 137-page order. The commission actually had thousands and thousands of pages of pre-filed testimony, cross-examination, exhibits, calculations, expert reports, modeling, anything you can imagine. The commission had to wade through that and figure out how they were going to make a decision. So you can certainly read through their excellent synopsis of everything that was put before them, but I would encourage you to just jump forward to page 101, which is where the commission really starts explaining their decisions and their rationale. Here, the commission is the commission really lays out the decisions that it makes dealing with offshore wind. The first one that they reached is that they find it is not appropriate at this time for Duke Energy Renewables Wind to sell the Carolina Long Bay project to Duke Energy Progress. The commission is worried about risk to ratepayers. You know, they would be authorizing $200 and some odd million for something that, you know, arguably could be abandoned at some point in the future. Obviously, that's not what anybody wants to see, but technically it does provide some risk to ratepayers that they would be paying for something that doesn't generate electricity at the end of the day. And the commission is charged with protecting the interests of ratepayers. So they say this is something that we're going to re-examine as we get closer to the offshore wind project coming online. A little bit ahead in that, they go through a lot of history because there are 3 different wind energy areas. And Duke Energy, Avangrid, and Total were all parties to the carbon plant proceeding. And guess what? Each of them wanted their specific wind energy area to be the first one that moves forward. So there is a lot of arguing about which wind energy area is best. And the commission says basically, we don't have enough evidence at this time. So the commission tells Duke, you need to go back, do a study, compare your wind energy area to Total's, to Avangrid's. Look at the cost, look at the benefit, look at who has better wind, look at who has the shortest distance to bring the power onshore, and come back to us. You have to come back later in 2023 for the next biennial carbon plant proceeding. So do this report and come back to us later this fall. So they directed Duke to study these 3 wind energy areas. They told them to file the study with their carbon plan on September 1st of 2023 or sooner if it's done before then. But the commission really wants to get more evidence in front of them in the next carbon plan proceeding before really making a decision about how this is going to start showing up, when it's going to show up, how it's going to be dealt with in rates, those sorts of things. I think one of the things that's also important to flag is that the commission tells Duke that they should go ahead and start doing the transmission planning. Regardless of what which wind energy facility is selected, we've got to find a way to get that power. There simply is not enough load at the coast to accommodate all of that energy. And we've got to find a way to get it to the middle of the state. There are areas in the middle of the state that I could talk for hours about, but y'all don't want to hear, where the transmission system has just become congested because we have a lot of solar in that area. So we have to find a way to deal with that. Moving offshore wind power across an already congested grid, I'm not an engineer, but I know enough to know that that's an issue. So Duke has a lot of things in front of them on the transmission side of things that the commission has told them, if it doesn't matter which project it goes for, if that upgrade needs to be made, go ahead and start working So while the commission did punt on a lot of issues related to offshore wind, this is at least something that is pretty important, because no matter what, we're going to have to address the transmission system issues in order to bring offshore wind online. So flipping forward just a couple of more pages, you'll see that on page 130, the commission starts to get into their ordering paragraphs. These are, very cut and dry. It is ordered that Duke shall file its next carbon plan on September 1st. But the offshore wind ones in particular are on page 133, they're 26 and 27. And that's the Duke shall study the 3 offshore wind areas, and the Duke should also go ahead and pursue any federal funding that is available through the IIJA or IRA that can assist offshore wind. And that's something that I think popped up a lot throughout the carbon plan order, but the commission chose to reiterate it for offshore wind. So I'm happy to talk as much as you all want about the carbon plan decision. I'm happy to talk about all of the other issues that were before the Utilities Commission, whether it's what role hydrogen is going to play in the future energy sector, how much solar is going to be deployed. But that was my presentation, and I am happy to answer any questions that y'all might have.
And before we get to questions, I want to apologize, Peter, your handout only made every other page to our packets.
I'm sorry about that.
All the pages you referenced, we were missing. But we
If
will
anybody
make
wants to see my one copy, you're welcome to borrow it, but we'll get you the correct version.
Right, and we have it. We will make sure that task force members receive it electronically, but it will also be posted on our website for anyone interested in referring to the report that Peter referenced. So, again, we apologize for that oversight. Anyone have any questions for Peter?
Okay. I'm sorry. Yes, ma'am.
Peter, thank you for that wonderful report. We look forward to seeing all those pages that you were referencing. But if you could, because it helps some of us who are not focused on this every day, can you talk a little bit more about the transmission development process that they're telling you to go ahead and start, and highlight, if you would, the role that you said that solar is playing in causing the congestion of the grid, especially in the middle of the state, and why only the middle of the state is highlighted.
Sure, and I'm going to ask Mark to correct me, interject as appropriate. It takes a long time to build new wires for a lot of different reasons. Some of them are very similar to what offshore wind is dealing with. There are a lot of different agencies that are involved in permitting new transmission facilities. They have to, you've got to go through and deal with landowners. You've got to make sure that everything is permitted by a city. You've got to get permission from the state, from the Utilities Commission, in order to build a facility, which means you have to show that it's needed. Depending on if you're building new wires or upgrading old wires, if there's something existing that's being upgraded, you've got to turn the power off to those wires before the folks can be there actually making the upgrades. Well, you got to time that correctly so that it's not a hot August day when everybody is using their air conditioning. So there's a lot of logistical things that go into just the construction of transmission upgrades. And that takes a lot of time. Mark, am I missing anything there?
No, you did a great job, Peter. I would just add that, and you're certainly familiar with the history of utility-scale solar development in Eastern North Carolina. There was a time, only a few short years ago, when as high as 60% of all new utility-scale solar projects in the United States were being sited in North Carolina east of I-95. And so that creates a huge challenge with respect to transmission, because you're essentially siting generation away from where you use the energy, and you've got to get that energy from where you're generating it to where you use it, and thus the congestion problem and the transmission challenges. The good news is, one of the things that Peter didn't mention with respect, he certainly did talk about the role of transmission in the carbon plan, but we identified a series of areas in the state we call red zone areas, which are areas that are experiencing significant congestion today. In the carbon plan, we identified where those are red zone projects, and we asked the commission to authorize us to proceed with making system upgrades to alleviate the congestion that we're experiencing in those areas, and they gave us approval to proceed with those red zone projects. So the good news is there's going to be lots of transmission-related investment. The difficult news is siting new transmission is really hard for all the reasons that Peter identified. You know, folks love the idea of zero emitting energy. They don't love the idea of a transmission line being in their backyard. And so, you know, the challenge, of course, is going to be how do we get all this work done efficiently and quickly so that, you know, we can realize the decarbonization that we all want to realize.
And I'll add on the solar specifically, there's a reason why it's been showing up in the coastal plan in particular. I mean, you just look at the geography of North Carolina. You know, if you go to the western part of the state, you've got mountains. Those create shade. Shade does not play nice with solar. Those have trees. You've got to clear trees. Nobody wants to cut down a forest to build solar panels. But if you look at eastern North Carolina, you've got largely cleared land. You've got largely flat lands. You've got lots of open spaces. So there are pretty understandable reasons why the eastern part of the state has been where solar developers look to site new projects. In turn, when you have a lot of projects in a relatively small geographic area, you run into the exact problems that Mark set out. And so the commission did approve, in addition to the specific offshore wind transmission items that I noted, a whole suite of 14, I think, very large transmission upgrades that they approved Duke to go ahead and make. So just big picture help the grid like that.
Just another quick note on transmission. I think it was David, you who brought this issue up to the task force in our very first meeting, as I recall. But I have to compliment Peter and probably Jennifer and Jeremy Tarr. I remember, this is sort of a full circle moment because we sat around a conference table in Environmental Defense Fund after we spent much time here talking about Executive Order 80 and Clean Energy Plan implementation. And before there was any mention of a BOEM auction for lease areas in North Carolina, at least Carolina Long Bay, we were talking about the need for elevating the transmission issue in the conversation. And so I think it was Catherine Collins at Southeastern Wind Coalition who drafted a proposal to the Transmission Planning Collaborative about upgrading onshore transmission to accommodate offshore. And here we are some years later with an order from the commission that gives us the opportunity to proceed with that work. So I think everybody acknowledges that the transmission assets are a huge challenge, but it's kind of nice to see, you know, start with an Executive Order 80 and a Clean Energy Plan, and here we are some years later, and we're making good on what many folks believed was necessary at the time. So.
Nicole, would you please pass the microphone to
One of the elements in the order around transmission was that the way, and I'm looking for either confirmation or like, no, you didn't get it, is what it says is that all existing transmission upgrades take priority over any new planned transmission upgrades. I mean, it's like one sense clause, it's one of those things you should read over. But the reason that's important is obviously that begs the question of how deep is the backlog portfolio on existing transmission upgrades. And while the permission was given to develop the landfall to landfall transmission. That still provides a fairly substantive gap. So the question is what's the backlog, and when would that priority over new programs kick in, so offshore wind transmission injection into the grid would no longer be a secondary priority? Some of us did read it.
I'm glad. So the transmission planning process is a lengthy process. Basically, it starts off with Duke, Dominion, co-ops, municipalities saying, we've got an issue. This line is getting too close to being overheated. We are seeing new load in this county that we need to build new lines for, whatever it might be. And so it goes through a multi-step planning process. Basically, the first step of it, Mark mentioned the Transmission Planning Collaborative, where the North Carolina utilities get together and say, hey, here are all of the issues that we're identifying, and we need to study. And then it goes through, I'm a lawyer, not an engineer, it goes through a whole bunch of engineering studies to look at power flow and line ratings and all the things that Mark knows that I don't. And that takes a significant amount of time. I mean, that can be a year or two just to do the study process. Then it goes to another study process. It rolls up into an entire Southeast regional transmission planning process. And then they've got to go to the Utilities Commission to say, here is all the evidence of why we need this new line. Give us permission to build this new line. And then they've got to go out and build the thing. So Duke has already identified all of these 14 red zone projects. They've been through all of that study process. Some of them may require going before the commission, some of them may not. So I'm not particularly concerned that those get priority, because the offshore wind projects, they still have to go through all of those various study steps that can actually take years. I mean, Mark, from just like idea to flipping the switch and a wire being on, how long does that usually take?
Long time. It's years, and I think you're right, Peter. I think the order gives us sort of the cover that we needed to really execute on those red zone system upgrades for existing infrastructure. But because the process for studying new transmission to integrate offshore is sufficiently long, I think the hope is you clear through that backlog of work, and then when you need to do it, you're ready to do it on the offshore side. There's also FERC involvement for some of these power lines, right, transmission lines. So it's a lengthy and potentially painful process. Environmental permitting. I mean, there's a whole litany of steps. But as Peter said, that work has essentially been done for much of the work that needs to be done on existing lines. So hopefully we can make rapid progress.
Any more questions or comments for Peter? Let's see if anyone online is. I don't see any questions online. All right, Peter, thank you so much for that report. And again, we will make sure that everyone receives the complete report electronically, and we'll post it on our website as well for the public.
We complete the bridge report. You don't need all 100.
The summary version.
Madam Chair,
I'm sorry.
in your inboxes is the document that Peter had shared with everybody. I believe we're getting new copies printed now, and the document is also posted up on the Towers website.
So Jennifer just has emailed that to everyone, so you should have it in your inbox, and again, it will be posted on NCTOWERS website as well. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Peter. All right, and we are running ahead of schedule, so you get an extra 5 minutes for your break. How about that? So we're going to break. Please be sure to mute your microphones if you have one near you. We'll return at 11. Okay, thank you, everyone. And John, before you get started, I have taken the privilege of introducing another item right before you. We're going to have Justin Sosne, a member who is with us remotely, and let's see if we can get Justin on screen. Hopefully we can. He's going to give us an update on our UK, and our alliance with our delegation there. Justin, can you, if you will unmute, can you hear me? And let's see if we can get you on the screen.
Yes, I can hear you, Marquita. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, thank you.
Great. Happy to proceed whenever you're ready.
Okay, we are ready. We can see you and we can hear you.
Okay, well, fantastic. Thank you so much for providing a few minutes on the agenda for me to share an update. And I apologize for not being there in person. I am wrapping up my COVID quarantine, so in the interest of public health, I wanted to spare each of you, but look forward to joining in person next time. So just to very quickly thank everyone once again for your warm hospitality during UK delegation's visit in November. Feedback from the delegates was extremely positive. Folks were very impressed with the level of commitment and coordination that they saw. You know, they said that they had wished that they had been this coordinated earlier on in their process. So once again, thank you for that. So just to provide a very brief update of where we've come in the last few months and where we're headed on the UK collaboration front. So the final week of January, we held the first working group meeting under the auspices of the North Carolina UK Memorandum of Understanding. That meeting was co-chaired by Secretary Sanders and UK Deputy Consul General Colin Gray. Marquita and Jennifer, we were also pleased to have them join us too. Offshore wind was one of the three main agenda items. So during that discussion, we discussed the progress that had already been made, but also where we're headed along several important verticals. So to start, supply chain. So we are working to plan in coordination with UK Department for National Trade, a series of seminars that will involve experts in the UK further sharing their experience. This will take place virtually leading up into IPF 2024, where we hope to do a seminar in person. And these will actually be not just North Carolina focused, but hopefully at least East Coast, if not national, in orientation. I should also say that we've started to see some bites, so to speak, from UK companies in the offshore wind space interested in growing their North Carolina footprint. So one of these is QCS staffing. One of their verticals is offshore wind staffing specifically. We've also heard from TNEI, which is a UK engineering firm that also does work in offshore wind. So I'm pleased to say that as we ramp up our efforts, that there are UK companies starting to catch wind of the size of the opportunity here in North Carolina. In addition to supply chain, we started to develop some academic partnerships. So a group of UNC Chapel Hill students will be headed to Hull in June to meet with some of the stakeholders who were here back in November and to learn about the ecosystem there. Also Unisys, Mick Flynn, a managing partner for Unisys, which was the group that did the visualization study around Wilmington, will be coming to North Carolina in March to attend UNC's Clean Tech Summit. We also have continued dialogue around ports and how we may be able to assist with technology as it relates to visualization studies and thinking about how ports can be utilized to support offshore wind. Fisheries, we've continued ongoing dialogue in that space as well. So all of these things are continuing. Our next big milestone is June, when we will have a delegation visit the UK from North Carolina, which will include Secretary Sanders and Marquita and others for a meeting in London and potentially visits to other places throughout the UK. It will also be the same week as the Global Offshore Wind Conference that Marquita and Jennifer attended last year in Manchester. So We have some exciting opportunities ahead, but as I believe Marquita or Jennifer shared earlier, if you have questions or would like to get further plugged in with any stakeholders in the UK, please just don't hesitate to reach out. But thank you, Madam Chair, for the opportunity to provide the update.
Thank you, Justin. Any questions for Justin before we move into our committee reports? All right, and John Hardin is ready to present for our Economic Opportunity and Business Development Subcommittee. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm John Hardin with the North Carolina Department of Commerce, and I'm representing the Economic Opportunity and Business Development Subcommittee, chaired by Justin Sosne, who you just heard from, and Michelle Query. I'm going to do two things today. I'm going to tell you about a report that Jennifer Mundt referenced earlier. I'm going to go a little deeper into that. I should note that when you are done reading the carbon plan, which is more than 100 pages, you can also turn your attention to this report, which is 209 pages. And so I'm going to give you just the highlights of that, but it's really worth digging into this report. It's a very important report. I'm also going to give you an update on the activities of our subcommittee. So our subcommittee, I won't read all these points, but essentially we focus on all of the economic opportunity, which you'll see in a moment, is huge, related to offshore wind. And that's not just turbines off the coast of North Carolina, but turbines up and down the entire East Coast. Large manufacturing supply chain opportunity. Lots of ways to do that, and those are listed in the bullet points there, all within our charge. So this report that you see was released less than a month ago by the National Renewable Energy Lab, or NREL, which is part of the U.S. Department of Energy. But it was also, they had a combined effort on that. They also included the Business Network for Offshore Wind, which is the biggest business association for offshore wind, as well as Tufts University. And that's a hot hyperlink if you want to read all 209 pages. And it is a really thoughtful report. A lot of data went into it and a lot of good research analysis. It is the best, most up-to-date assessment of the supply chain challenges and opportunities for the entire U.S. And a lot of it is relevant for North Carolina. As you can see in those two tables to the right, which are not actually in the report, they're on the website that you can link to. That's where you'll find those reports. There's a huge opportunity in terms of all the component parts. If there are 2,100 wind turbines that need to be produced to reach by 2030 the goal of 30 gigawatts of power, if you assume that there are roughly 8,000 parts in the wind turbine, we're talking millions of parts that need to be manufactured. And that's a lot of what this report is about. You can see the dollars that we're talking about in terms of the various components. Every one of those is a billion with a B, not millions, and it adds up to tens of billions of dollars of investment that will be needed to realize this goal of 30 gigawatts by 2030. The good news, but also the challenge, is that the majority of the offshore wind manufacturing facilities have yet to be announced. So only a small minority have actually been announced. Most of those are not in North Carolina, but all those green bars that you see are opportunities for North Carolina to enter that supply chain. And this is over the next decade or two. So it's a long-running opportunity. One of the most important things about this report is it has several scenarios. One of those is what they call, I guess, the baseline scenario, or the conservative scenario, which is what you see in that orange line. And that is, if we were to essentially take no further action, just kind of let the market develop on its own without any impetus. The first part of that, the green and orange that goes from 2023 to 2025, almost all of those components are going to need to be made internationally. And that's because there's just not the supply chain here in the U.S. But starting in 2025, the supply chain will start to develop. If it just started to develop on its own, it would be on that path. That's in orange. And that's, as you can see, the lowest path. And we don't reach 30 gigawatts by 2030. And we still would require, let me read this, it is 17 gigawatts out of the 30 would still need to be supplied by foreign producers. However, if we take action, the U.S. and North Carolina, we could be on the green line, which would entail only 7.2 gigawatts produced internationally, much more produced domestically. And that's the key message of this report, is huge opportunity. The extent to which we realize that opportunity depends very much on how much we seize that opportunity. We'll get some on our own, but we'll get a lot more if we push for it. Another good piece of news is that there are really kind of two ways to think about the manufacturing for offshore wind. There are the major components, which are kind of the tier 1 components, which are represented by that orange area. And then there are what are called the tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers, which are represented more by the blue, whether it's light blue or dark blue. The majority of the opportunity in the whole manufacturing supply chain is in the tier 2 and tier 3. And that's good for North Carolina. We have some opportunity in the tier 1 too, but we have a huge opportunity in the tier 2 and tier 3, and that's where the majority of those 8,000 parts exist. If you search the report for North Carolina or NC, it comes up a lot because North Carolina, of all the states they studied, ranks pretty high. This is how we rank in terms of the potential for manufacturing facilities relative to other states. We're not top, we're not up with California, but California is a much bigger state, but we're solidly in the second tier among our peer states. And so we've got a real opportunity for manufacturing facilities. This map also shows you that in terms of the tier 2 and tier 3 components, as far as the potential to manufacture them, this is based on an index that the researchers developed that was called Adjacent Industry Manufacturing Scale, or AIMS. It's a multi-factor index based on the share of the state's GDP that comes from manufacturing, the proximity to ports, proximity to the shore, several factors. North Carolina ranks right up there. It's as dark as California and as dark as any of those other states up there. But again, the point is, this will happen only if we take action. If we sit back, this may not happen. And so this task force is on this, and I think more is going to come out of this, but we have work to do. Another thing that I have not highlighted in this, but it is highlighted in the report, is that ports are central to this. They predict about 8 manufacturing ports will be needed up and down the east coast of the U.S. North Carolina has 2 ports, and they could be the linchpin for a lot of this activity. And so I won't talk about that, but there is a panel later that is going to talk about that. Just another way of showing, this is for the job market opportunity. Once again, North Carolina is right up there. So we're strong in manufacturing potential, strong in job market potential. This just shows you the same thing, but with respect to GDP, a large share of our GDP could come from offshore wind component manufacturing. This shows you a list of the various components that would go into an offshore wind turbine. So there's the blade, the nacelle, the tower. And North Carolina is specifically mentioned there for at least 2. These are green, these are where we have opportunity. A blade factory or a gravity-based manufacturing factory as well. And I imagine that we have potential in some of those others as well, but those are the ones that they specifically called out. And so Department of Commerce and the EDP&C is actively speaking with companies that may be interested in these opportunities. So the key takeaways of the report are the following. Much of this I've already said. If we want to achieve this national goal, and this is a national goal of 30 gigawatts by 2030, we can do it, and it would provide huge benefits, including helping existing suppliers. This is not just a bunch of new companies coming in. A lot of the opportunities for existing companies just to pivot to the opportunity, to make things that either they already make but don't make for this sector, or make things that are close to what they make but are changed a little bit to serve the offshore wind sector. Huge opportunity. But if we want to realize that opportunity, we as a nation really need to ramp up our manufacturing activities with respect to offshore wind. And the report, which we won't detail here, does have a series of recommendations for how to do that. And they divide that into short run, short term, medium term, and long term. And the good news is, most everything that's in there, it's a little more than what we're doing. Everything that they mention is something that we are already doing. I think there's more that we could do, but we are on the right path. So, if we want to realize those benefits, the degree to which we do that depends on how quickly and strongly we seize the opportunity. And I'm going to outline now some of the recommendations, some of the activities that the Economic Opportunity Subcommittee is pursuing. And I have a feeling after today, we may take on a few more activities, whether we like it or not, but I think we need to do it. So this is one final slide to show you that if you don't want to read all 209 pages of this report, there will be a webinar on this report coming up March 2nd, and the link is provided there. I believe it's free, and we've already seen several presentations of this report, and it is getting a lot of coverage, and if only because you need to be in the know with what everyone else knows, you should pay attention to this report. It's a great report. All right, switching gears to this particular subcommittee. We actually have a multi-activity work plan. This does not list every single one of those, but this lists the key ones. The first activity that we had was to enhance North Carolina's offshore wind supply chain registry. And so what that means is many states have something like this. It's essentially a database where companies that are in the offshore wind supply chain, whether they're in North Carolina or another state or another country and want to be active in the North Carolina supply chain, they can put their information in there. It's almost like a dating service for the offshore wind supply chain. And when we had a supply chain assessment done a couple of years ago, the consultants set one up for us. Since that time, we've received almost 200 entries into that, but where we are now is that's still just an intake device. We haven't made it publicly available, and so that's the next step, is we want to make it publicly available, searchable, and we're still working through questions about what's the best way to do that. The Business Network for Offshore Wind has a supply chain registry. It's probably the biggest one out there, but it's not very user-friendly. It's hard to search by state, and we want people to be able to search by state. But we still may partner with them. We also are going to have continued conversations with the Southeastern Wind Coalition. And Catherine, I don't know if we've discussed that, but we are going to have continued discussions. So again, whether you like it or not, we're going to have discussions. And they actually have a great supply chain registry, but it's not just for North Carolina, it's for the whole southeastern U.S., but we play nicely with the other states, and that's actually one of the recommendations of that report is very few states can do this on their own. They need to collaborate with others, and to the extent that they collaborate with others, the entire pie will be bigger, and then each of us can get our own larger shares of that pie. And as Jennifer's already told you before, we have, and you all know, we have already a consortium with Maryland and Virginia called Smart Power that does just that. And so the short answer on this one is we're working on a solution to get this information out there, and we're going to have it available by the end of this quarter and before the next meeting. So the next activity is to develop a website for about North Carolina's offshore wind activities. We already have one, but also that was created about 2 years ago. And I put most of the content in there, and so you know it's not going to be that great because I'm not a web designer, and I did the best I could, but we need to move to version 2.0 now. And so we had a meeting last week, Susan Fleetwood and I did, and Gina Renfro with our communications staff at Commerce. And in the near future, we're going to be redeveloping that site, going to put more information on there, make it more navigable, if that's the term, and just beef it up. We may eventually spin it out into its own website, but I think in the short run, it's going to be on the Department of Commerce's website. So the next activity is to identify supply chain categories that we really want to target. What's really in North Carolina's sweet spot with respect to that whole supply chain. And so in order to do that, we are doing our own research at Commerce, but we also are going to these conferences that Jennifer has referenced. The International Partnering Forum, or IPF, is a great conference, and I'll be going to that, Jennifer will be going to that, Martina will be going, and others from Commerce will be going to that. It's going to be in Baltimore, and it's just nonstop networking, and also just seeing what capabilities and technologies are out there. Huge exhibition floor, great opportunity to network and build connections. We also will be going, some of us, to Wind Europe, which is going to be in Copenhagen in April, and that's a very large international wind conference, of course. And we're actually working with the Danish government, and Jennifer's leading this, to get a specialized tour before the conference and potentially after the conference, where the Danish government essentially takes us around and introduces us to companies that may have an interest in working in North Carolina or lending their expertise. The Danish government actually has a mandate to reach out to other countries to help them reduce carbon. And so they reached out to us, and so we've taken them up on that. We're also, work boats are critical to this. If you read that report, you'll see how many boats are needed, and these are not just any old boat, these are specialized boats. And Bob Peel, who is on the committee, that's his area of expertise. He's done a little digging and looking around the country to say who could potentially make these boats in North Carolina, who in North Carolina could, if they're not making these boats, could potentially change his business model to make them. And so Bob's worked on that. We've still got a little more work to do, but that's coming along. And then we're also working on assets, sites that have water access. And these are not just the major ports, but these are some inland ports or some areas that where manufacturing facilities could be located with easy access to the water, or other reasons that you might want to be on the water to ship goods and services. We've developed that as well. And that actually is the end of my presentation. I thought I had one more, but that's it. So the committee has been busy, and we're going to be busier now that that report is out. Happy to take questions.
Thank you for that report, John. Reflecting back on the email report that you referenced, and the more than 8,000 parts that go into creating a wind turbine, those smaller parts, most of them can be made anywhere in the state. And so that's where our manufacturing base will be very helpful, as it currently is, in helping those companies to pivot to be able to support that supply chain. But the larger components, if I'm hearing you correctly, those have to be made near the water at the ports, which is why the ports are so important to our progress in this. And so, thank you for pointing that out. I think just want to make sure that everyone is aware of the opportunity with the supply chain here, and why so much interest on our ports here, because they have a crucial role in our success in reaching that 2030 target for 2.8 gigawatts.
Right, the visible parts that everyone sees, the tower, the blade, the nacelle, those all need to be assembled and in large part manufactured close to water. And so that's why the ports are so critical. but all the component parts need to get out to the sites where they're going to be located in the ocean, and that's why the ports are also critical. And so the ports are a linchpin, and irrespective of the ports, the manufacturing opportunity is strong for the entire state because of all those various parts you mentioned.
Well, we have some great assets here with our ports. I'm sure Brian will talk about that later. But thank you so much. Any questions for John before he is seated? Any comments on the economic outreach, economic development? Susie?
Just in terms of manufacturing the smaller components that can be done, quote, anywhere. I've been a recent advocate for global transport and the activity that's ongoing in manufacturing in that part of our state. And I'd just like to reemphasize that in addition to global transport being, situated where it is, its relationship with the 6 community colleges in and around that 6-county area is they've done a tremendous amount of work in bringing those community colleges together to do specific workforce training for aviation in particular. But I could see a real opportunity for promotion of that part of our state and what's happening on the education front there as well. So I don't know how that gets folded into a report or how we might do more outreach toward their leadership and engage them in further discussion for those smaller manufacturing businesses.
Yes, that's a great point. And we did, a small delegation of us did visit the GTP, and I guess you were part of that, if I remember right, and talked to them about offshore wind. They're only about an hour from Morehead City on rail and on road. And what we do when we go to this conference, like IPF, is we have a large exhibit booth here. And there's an exhibit floor with hundreds of exhibitors, and we have, a listing of North Carolina's assets. And the ports and the GTP are right up there. And a lot of people stop. A lot of people know North Carolina for things like golf and basketball, but they don't know us for our ports, or not as well, or they probably don't know the global transport. And when they hear about it, they're really first enlightened and too impressed and interested. And when we have this exhibit floor or exhibit booth, we actually are going to be co-located with Virginia and Maryland and kind of collectively branded as Smart Power as well. And that tends to get a lot of people there. And because Maryland is the host of this conference this year, and we are located next to Maryland, we have a prime location on the exhibit floor where pretty much everybody at the conference has to walk past us. And I think there's even a coffee stop for the festival. So we're going to be telling the story.
And thank you, Susie, for mentioning Global Transport. That is a huge asset for us that we often don't tout enough, but certainly very significant to our transportation system pipeline here, and will be very important to offshore wind for us as well.
And my geography is probably a little bit off, but with the presence of CCX and all of those things that are happening in that quadrant of the state, I think it's a good opportunity.
Any more questions or comments for John? Thank you, John.
Thank you.
So in a moment, we'll hear an update from our Outreach and Engagement Subcommittee, but I want to just note that all of our subcommittees are working towards the goals that they identified in fiscal year 21 and 22. And at the end of this fiscal year in June, we're providing another report to the governor's office on the status of our work. During the last task force meeting in November, the Workforce Education and Training Opportunity Subcommittee provided a presentation on workforce data for construction and installation occupations in offshore wind. The subcommittee's next step is to further analyze the data and assess North Carolina's inventory of wind-relevant training programs to inform future workforce recommendations. And we'll not hear an update from the Workforce Subcommittee this week, but please know that they continue working to advance their goals. I know we've had a couple of companies reach out to us already, wanting to have ties to our community colleges and university system for setting up training programs in collaboration. So we'll look forward to an update at our next meeting from the Workforce Subcommittee. In addition, you recall that our Infrastructure Subcommittee shifted course last year and is now fulfilling its scope to research, evaluate, and make recommendations regarding transmission and other offshore wind-related infrastructure and components. The subcommittee is reviewing and learning about wind energy facility infrastructure and transmission, including foundations, towers, cabling, offshore substations, points of interconnection on land and onshore infrastructure. And we did hear from Mark how complicated that is, and it's not so easy to just say we need a transmission line in a certain place at a certain time, and I think that's going to happen without a lot of advanced work. So in January, the subcommittee heard from experts in the U.S. Department of Energy's Grid Deployment Office, who provided an informative overview of the offshore wind transmission topologies and shared early findings from a comprehensive transmission analysis that compares costs and benefits of transmission build-out scenarios while considering grid operability, reliability, and resilience, and environmental impacts. So it's my understanding that next month's subcommittee meeting will feature an expert presentation on either subsea cabling or foundations. So we look forward to that. All right, we will now proceed to our Outreach and Engagement Subcommittee.
President tried to jump off the table. So the first thing I want to do is to thank the members of our committee and our wonderful staff, my co-chair, Susie, Natalie English, David Kelly, Carly Lohan, Whit Tuttle, our staff, Lex James, and Gina Renfro. We would not be here with a presentation if it were not for them. And so just to remind you of what our committee's charge is, we are to identify and engage offshore wind stakeholders in North Carolina and beyond with a communication strategy that advocates for policies prioritizing offshore wind development. If I could tweak that at all, I would change the word strategy to strategies, because what we are finding is as we go out to our communities and our stakeholder groups, we are finding that they are different. We need different forms of meetings. We need different forums. We need different channels of communication, and we are adapting as we learn and as we go along. And I think if there is an overall strategy, it is to adapt to whatever we need to do to make sure that we hear whatever we need to hear and communicate whatever we need to communicate.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and that is a really good point. It's one that we will talk about thematically through the rest of the presentation, so thank you for that. One of the first things we did, of course, was develop a survey for the list of 700 plus people that had expressed an interest in learning more about offshore wind, and those being stakeholders or those that are just interested in the subject matter. So we've sent out the survey last fall, I believe it was. We sent it twice to make sure that we were hitting everybody at least a couple of times to see what kind of response we would get. So the 700 individuals have now been compiled into a master contact list that we use for our newsletter and other communication strategies. So we promoted it on commercial and social media channels, the NCTOWERS webpage. Governor Cooper did a press release from his office, and we promoted it, of course, during our task force meetings. And we've had a really great response, and we'll get into all those details as we move forward. Next slide. Oh, a second survey will be taken on sometime in 2023 in the upcoming months.
So we received 465 responses to the survey with a completion rate of 100%. And not every respondent answered every question, but once they started the survey, nobody dropped out of the survey. So that demonstrates to us that people are interested. Some people are intensely interested, and that means that we have a great opportunity. And you'll see in the slide the top stakeholder groups, environmental and wildlife advocate were the biggest, with other being second. And among the other, the majority of those were
so I hope everybody can see this. If you can't, we'll provide an updated copy if we don't already have one in your packet. You can see that who the top voters were, the top stakeholder groups, and for this were, they were, as Ben said, 51% of them were wildlife or environmental advocates, 49%, which is a close second, coastal homeowners, business owners, and offshore wind industry consultants, and then about 15% were local, also check the box for local elected official or a member of a specific demographic or community such as our tribal communities.
Continuing with the survey, when we ask in which county of the state do you live, 42% of the respondents live in Brunswick County, 13% live in Dare County, and 8% in Carteret County. So this coastal county is obviously very well represented, and 8% live in Wake County, 6% in New Hanover County, and those results from those counties that I listed represent 3/4 or about 77% of the respondents. And I do want to say that the large Brunswick County response emphasizes our need to get down there and provide a forum, which we will talk about a little bit, just a little bit later here.
And these are interesting results. The next 3 slides, I think, are very telling. Of the 465 folks that answered, all 465 respondents did answer this question. And many of them described their knowledge of offshore wind energy is highly knowledgeable. The majority said somewhat knowledgeable, and then a smaller percentage, 28%, said that they, or less than 28%, said that they had minimal knowledge of offshore wind.
And nearly 2/3 of the respondents, 64%, said that they are very interested in learning about offshore wind energy in North Carolina, and 1/4 say that they are somewhat interested. So that's 89, almost 90%, saying to some degree they're very interested in learning more about this. And just as an aside, as we've been planning our Brunswick Forum, some of the conversations I've had have been with coastal mayors in that area, and they describe what they perceive as an information vacuum in those communities, that people don't have enough information to really be able to say whether they're for or against, or to have an informed opinion. And so again, these forums are the best mechanism that we have for getting the information directly to those communities.
So in this slide, if you'll refer back to 2 slides back, 67 or 61% said they had some knowledge of offshore wind, and 28% said they were highly knowledgeable about offshore wind energy. But when asked, how would you describe the level of knowledge among your community members, more than 51% said that most of the people in their community have minimal knowledge of offshore wind. So they think themselves to be very knowledgeable in the majority of cases, but they're not convinced that their communities and their neighbors share that same level of understanding as it relates to offshore wind energy. So, and then of course the majority there said that it was minimal among their communities, which gives us an opportunity, as Ben was saying, to get down into those areas where the response has been heaviest and really start to educate and share with people what it is we're talking about.
So in this question, we ask in the community in which they live, how would they describe the level of support? So this is another speculative answer on their part. 36% reported that they are not sure about the level of support among members of their community for the responsible development of offshore wind. 17% say community members somewhat oppose, 26% say community members strongly oppose, and 17% say community members somewhat support. And again, people are guessing to some degree about how their neighbors feel, and in the absence of a forum, you really haven't been able to have those public discussions, and so we will get a better feel as we go forward. This last are strongly opposed increased quickly late in the survey, and a lot of those responses came from Brunswick County. And again, emphasizing the need for us to have a forum there to share information and deal with those concerns are.
Hopefully, we'll see some changes in the follow-up survey from having spent a little more time down there and engaging with the community. So the overwhelming support for a community meeting is certainly there. 68% of the respondents said that they would attend an offshore wind discussion in their community to learn more. And so we see that as our opportunity to really make some headway in helping people understand the benefits of offshore wind energy and why our country is going to such great lengths to turn our focus in that direction. So it was encouraging to see that they're willing to learn more and they're willing to come and participate. And I'll note again that this was all 465 respondents answered each one of these questions. So we're getting the material back that we see. Even if they skipped some other questions, these key ones they did respond to.
And so, are you interested in subscribing to our monthly newsletter that describe our activities? 2/3 of the respondents, or 65%, a total of 301, said that they were interested. I don't know how many subscribers we actually have at this point, but we know that, again, all of our survey results are saying that people are interested in learning more, and so the newsletter is another great mechanism for us to get that information out there.
Now, this is where we will break down, I think the next one, Did it advance?
Need to advance.
Our arrows have stopped. We broke it. There we go.
Yep, that's it.
There we go.
Thank you.
So, for context, 395 out of the 465 respondents answered this question. So there were 70 that dropped out of this question and did not respond. The demographics are telling us that we have a bit of work to do. 89% of the respondents in that part of the survey identify as white, 5% as American Indian or Alaska Native, 6% Black or African American, and 3% Hispanic or Latinx. And so we have been talking as a group for the last couple of months about how we improve these numbers and increase the diversity among our respondents. And we're working with some local folks, NCTOWERS, and others within the communities where we're going to be holding additional information meetings to try to step up that interest and try to bring those communities into the discussion at a greater degree than we've succeeded at so far. And because one of our members, Greg Richardson, was unable to be with us today, he asked that we mention the Native American Council, the Indian Council, as a resource for us to do improved outreach and communication in those communities as well. So we have asked Mr. Richardson to please, work with us on establishing those lines of communication and give us some ideas as how we can improve that outreach. So we see this as a slide and a place where we have a little bit of work to do and are committed to doing that.
This was about choosing the option for your year of birth, and 59% of these folks who completed the survey were baby boomers, born before 1966. 28% were Gen X, born between 1966 and 1980, and 11% were millennials, born between 1981 and 1996. So we also see that we have work to do. So we need pathways to these younger citizens who are probably curious, probably supportive, potentially supportive, but as we know, by conventional media are hard to reach. So as I said, in reiterating our charge, we are looking for channels as well for communication to these folks so so that we can get the survey in their hands and accurately assess how they feel about offshore wind.
I was particularly surprised that we didn't get more in the millennial range, but I'm sort of joking, maybe not totally joking, but the respondents were majority from Brunswick County, and I think we would all agree that there are a tremendous number of retirees in Brunswick County for obvious reasons, and probably has contributed to that skew in the age and demographics
Well,
slide.
and in many of those coastal counties,
Many of them,
a high number of retirees who are attuned to, these kind of surveys would be interested in responding.
Yeah. Okay, so this is a bit of a longer slide, just to give you an update as to what the engagements that we've already held. We've conducted 2 small pilot groups, roundtable discussions. August 3rd at Elizabeth City State University. Again, on November 15th at Carteret Community College in Morehead City. If you've not been there, it is a wonderful facility. And obviously the catering crowd there is very talented. We benefited from that. We had really strong and robust turnout for both of those meetings. One of the key process learnings from our pilots is that we need to do an offshore wind 101, so to speak, and really get back to the basics. Talk to everybody about what it is, what it means, and what the actual impacts are for their communities. We've taken questions during these events and will continue to do so to promote a 2-way discussion. And we are targeting holding them after hours, if you will, so that we can gain, that people have access to us, like teachers and other people that work until 5 o'clock and are still interested and need to be captured. So, and we're looking to engage with our members of our other subcommittees so that we can hold those kinds of more specific stakeholder meetings and roundtables to engage infrastructure and other discussion items that we can facilitate. And our next event for open house will be in Brunswick County at a date later, to be announced later, but most likely in March next month.
And so, remembering that from the poll responses, that 42% of the respondents live in Brunswick County, which was nearly 200 of the respondents on the survey, 68% of those, or 132 from Brunswick County, said that they would like to attend an offshore wind discussion in their community to hear more about the economic and environmental benefits of offshore wind for North Carolina and share their feedback about responsible development for offshore wind in our state. So as Susie alluded to, we are deep into the planning of an event. It will be sometime in March, toward the middle to end of March. We believe we have a finalized location, which will be Brunswick Community College. So they are willing to host us. As Susie also said, we are shooting for an evening time, so this would be a 4 p.m. to 7 p.m. event, again, so that we can get people coming out of work, coming home from picking kids up from school, wherever we need to get them from. So we are, frankly, really having run 2 smaller, and again, back to what I said, we're changing the format slightly. We've done 2 roundtables that were really just literally folks sitting in a circle with speakers on topics, and then discussion to hear feedback from the group of stakeholders that were invited there. This is going to be different. We envision this being an open house kind of format with tables with experts, subject matter experts around the room, and an open invitation for folks from the community to be able to come in, go to those experts, hear what they need to hear, and so we're adapting the format, again, to the community and to the means of outreach.
Okay, and this is the last and my favorite slide because we have the lovely Jennifer Mundt. And this is predominantly just information about the newsletter that we've sent around and the responses that we've got. We shared the survey information in the December newsletter that went out a couple of months ago, and we are encouraging everyone to share this link and to encourage others to sign up to receive the newsletter. It's not something that we're going to inundate in your mailboxes, but we do believe that having that connection through your networks will assist us also in reaching out to a broader range of North Carolinian stakeholders. And appreciate you sharing that link and forwarding it to those in your professional world, in your professional circles. So with that, I think we're finished. And again, we want to thank Gina and Lex and Jennifer and all the staff. We just couldn't do it without them. It's pretty evident.
Yes, it is.
But we're proud of the work we've done so far, and we think that we've only got more good work to do.
Yes. So, I'm happy to take questions or comments. Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you. And I echo your sentiments about the great work you've done so far. I have two questions. I think one related to question 8 in the survey. That was where you noted that there was I think you described it as kind of a late onrush of folks saying that they were strongly opposed.
Yes.
So, given that it was late, was there some specific event or occurrence that you think led to that frequency of answers toward the end of it?
I believe so. But Jennifer and Lex can maybe tell us, Gina can tell us maybe the timing of it, but there had been a couple of articles in small newspaper outlets down around the Brunswick, New Hanover County area that were somewhat critical toward the offshore wind effort, and I believe that might have stimulated some of that late run on that particular question.
All right. And that's actually, your answer is a good segue into my second question. So one of the other, I guess, few deficiencies in the work so far has been kind of the disparity in the respondents, right?
Yeah.
And so I was wondering, given that this offshore wind, other, offshore wind has environmental justice connotations. It doesn't necessarily have to be environmentally unjust, but there are clearly people that think there could be implications. So, and some of the organizations that tend to get involved with issues like that include the NAACP and other, groups that represent specific demographic groups. So given the disparity of respondents, have you tried reaching out to the NAACP as an example, or I know that you had a community outreach meeting at ECSU, but maybe even some more highly populous HBCUs or organizations like El Centro Hispano, so that might enable the outreach efforts to be as balanced as you want them.
I think the answer to that is partly all of the above in terms of outreach, and as we're learning, yes, we know specifically for this next roundtable that we will be reaching out to minority communities however we can reach them, looking for the leadership, and issuing invitations, making phone calls. One of the things I did personally recently, and this was not Brunswick County specific, but I ran into a friend of mine in a coastal community, and I said, look, this is going on. We know that we need a broader outreach. Would you be interested if I will bring subject matter experts to this community? Would you arrange a forum? And the answer was yes. And so I think a lot of it is going to have to be really personal, one-on-one, make a phone call, spend the time explaining what this is about and what the relevance of this is, issue that invitation. We have to draw people. It's not just going to be putting an announcement out there and sort of hoping they'll come. We know that we have work to do to build relationships in those communities, issue personal invitations, and get the people to the table.
And you've raised a really good point. The Brunswick County has one of the state's strongest NAACP chapters in place, and so they are a target group for us, obviously for the Brunswick County meeting, but also our relationships as a state with our HBCUs, and trying to engage the student population through the university systems, the HBCUs, in terms of getting them to complete the survey, or take the newsletter or get engaged in the conversation, even if they're not located in a coastal county. So these are great ideas, and yes, we've kicked them around, and that would be a part of it moving forward, as well as Mr. Richardson's request for engaging the tribal council.
And the Andrea Harris Task Force?
Yes.
Through the Department of Administration, that may be a group of leaders you want to engage too.
Great.
Kevin, thank you for those
Got one
questions.
here.
David, you have,
Yeah.
David
I also have
has
an
a
answer
question.
to Kevin's question, just very quickly to add. Fortunately, the Brunswick County Roundtable is happening in my backyard. I've got a lot of connections to some of the smaller grassroots organizations there, and SCWC did have a contractor to help do some DEI outreach and some partner mapping in terms of DEI outreach, so that is going to be our main resource for reaching those targeted groups in a one-on-one fashion for this upcoming roundtable.
Thank you, Carly. David?
Yeah, I'm going to expand your mandate. Goes back to John Hardin's presentation. There's a big stakeholder group in this state who are the tier 2 and tier 3 companies. And most of those companies haven't got a clue about offshore wind. And then we have the list that came out of the supply chain thing initially. So I think as we think about engaging people in maybe doing surveys or marketing or whatever it is, we need to start thinking now about maybe how the two committees can get together and talk about how we start getting the feedback, education, whatever it is, out to these tier 2, 3 companies, because we're going to have to do that. And I think some of the work you're doing, we're going to do surveys, maybe we can add another stakeholder group, but I know that wasn't your initial mandate, but it's something to think about, I think.
They're certainly part of the audience, for sure.
I have to tell you a funny story, because as I was trying to call mayors in the sort of the Wilmington area and those smaller beach communities, I called one and I launched into my spiel about this upcoming roundtable and how we were looking for input from coastal communities. And he said, well, I'm about 4 hours away. And I said, who did I call? And he said, the mayor of Boiling Springs. Well, I went back to my map. It was supposed to be Boiling Springs Lakes. That's the mayor I was trying to call. And I said, we will be back to you because you are in a community. You know, we talked about the manufacturing around that community, and I said, we will be back to you, just not right now.
Yeah.
Scott, Phyllis?
I turned it
Ms. Craig Taylor?
Thank you for that report, and it includes so much interesting information, but I want to go back to the DI efforts, and I'm happy to hear that Brunswick County has one of the strongest NAACP chapters. I say, being a card-carrying member, you will not find strong chapters in many of the eastern counties, and just adding to the list for outreach, if you can think about the denominational heads, association, religious associations, the presidents of those associations, bishops, and the ministerial alliances, because if you can get into the African American church, that's where our people are, and you will find at least an openness and willingness to listen if people are in that environment where they are already have a trust relationship. So sometimes it's good for the public locations, but just keep in mind for some people, if you really want them to come out and hear you, you have to go to them and where they already are safe and feel comfortable.
And you mentioned the need for an offshore wind 101.
Yes.
Right, and we've been talking about that sometime for doing it for even our own task force. But I do want to note for those who are listening that the Business Network for Offshore Wind has an Offshore Wind 101. It's an industry overview. It's a free 1-hour webinar. So if you're interested in getting, particularly those in the supply chain, but just generally if you want a good basic overview, it's free. The Business Network for Offshore Wind, their website is www.offshorewindus.org. So that will give you an opportunity to get an overview, but at some point, we will try to have someone actually come in for our task force to do that as well.
That was great. I will say between our first meeting, first roundtable and second roundtable, Carly Lohan did a really good job of boiling down information to a one-on-one that we used at the Morehead City meeting as well. So.
And I believe I didn't go on our tour when Dominion was gracious enough to take us to their towers off of Virginia Beach, but we did have someone from the Business Network that provided an overview then to the task force, but not all of our members were there, but we will have someone come to one of our stateside meetings.
Thank you, everybody.
And Avi, do you recognizing Avi before you pass it?
If I'm just gonna try to speak because Norris Tolson was here, he would probably kill me if I didn't say this. But I think this chart that was presented is one of the most telling charts for the opportunities for people and manufacturing and those tiers that I'm sure Brian, Clark, and the rest of the folks will get in this. But that is one of the most important pieces of information, and it goes to what this gentleman just said. And I think that's fantastic, but I do think that there is a huge gap of understanding the potential for jobs and the potential for manufacturing small companies because of the many parts that go into these offshore wind.
To put some numbers behind that, Avi, it's projected that more than 85,000 jobs will be created on the eastern shoreline, or just the eastern corridor, from offshore wind. $140 billion in capital investment for offshore wind on the eastern shoreline. North Carolina's projection of that is about, what is it, 10 billion? If I said millions, I meant billions. Billions with a B. I think North Carolina's projection is about 10 billion of that. And the jobs, I forget the number. Jennifer, can you refresh my memory on the jobs projected for North Carolina specifically from offshore wind?
I think we were projecting 100 billion in economic investments and then tens of thousands of jobs.
I was corrected, 100 billion to North Carolina from the offshore wind industry and tens of thousands of jobs. So, Avi, to your point, huge opportunity for North Carolina, and particularly for our tier 2 and 3 companies here. So thank you. Dana?
Thank you, Chairman. Just a plug for the infrastructure subcommittee. We're taking the sort of education around offshore wind piecemeal. We started with transmission. We've got a meeting on the 21st of March, the big day. It's the same day the Brunswick event, but big day. These subcommittee meetings are open to everyone, and we will be chunking up the offshore wind supply chain into these sort of digestible education pieces. So feel free to join us for that subcommittee in the future, and we'll make sure that everybody is aware of those dates.
And I want to take a moment to just acknowledge the great work that all of our subcommittees are doing. Just a fantastic dedication from our chairs, our co-chairs, our staff, and the task force members. Participation in our task force subcommittees is open to anyone. And so if you have an interest in supporting our infrastructure, our workforce development, our economic opportunity subcommittee, and our outreach and engagement, please contact any of us. You can go to our website for information, and we invite your participation.
Chair, may I make one quick comment? So yesterday, Jennifer, Mundt, and I were on a webinar led by the authors of that NREL report that I discussed. And they do have a series of recommendations, short-term, medium-term, long-term. But someone on the webinar asked, what's the one thing, if you have one recommendation for states that you would recommend that states do? And they have a long answer, but essentially it came down to education and outreach to, in this context, it was supply chain, but those tier 1, actually tier 2 and 3 manufacturers. People just don't know about offshore wind. And all of us know because we are in this room. but 99% of the population doesn't know. And I would assume probably the same percentage of the manufacturers. And so just spreading the word in a fashion that people can understand is what they recommend.
Thank you. All right, so we've managed to go from well ahead of schedule to 10 minutes behind. I know your stomachs are speaking to you right now, so we are going to break for lunch. We return at 1 p.m. for our panel discussion. Again, if you are seated near a microphone, please mute your microphone. And if you have not signed in, please sign our register. Thank you. As you refer to your materials for the full bio, but they have some phenomenal backgrounds. We'll start with, well, our moderator is Michelle Fury. Michelle serves as the Chamber for Innovation and Clean Energy Southeast Regional Director, working with Chamber and Economic Development professionals throughout North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, and Tennessee on how to best navigate renewable energy development to help their communities prosper. Michelle is also one of our task force members. Our own Brian Clark was appointed Executive Director of the North Carolina State Ports Authority in June 2020 and assumed the position in 2021. Under Clark's leadership, North Carolina ports completed critical infrastructure improvements, including container berth renovations, turning basin expansion, air draft improvements, and the addition of 3 new Neo-Panamax trains. And I do want to note that Brian has another commitment, so he's going to be with us for the first half of this panel, and then he'll have to leave. So thank you, Brian, for joining us. Also with us today, Chris Gullickson. Chris joined the Port of Virginia in August of 2013. Chris works closely with state, regional, and local economic development professionals with the goal of locating manufacturing facilities, distribution centers, and maritime-related operations in Virginia. Prior to joining the port, Chris spent 7 years at the Hampton Roads Economic Development Alliance. Chris, thank you for joining us. Also with us via WebEx is Jonathan Kennedy, Infrastructure Finance and Delivery Practitioner with U.S. and International Experience. Jonathan currently leads New Jersey's Economic Development Association's infrastructure group, which conceives, finances, and delivers transformative infrastructure projects on behalf of the state. And finally, rounding out our panel is David Kouros. David has nearly 20 years of experience in urban and regional planning, economic development, sustainability resilience, and urban design in the public, private, and civic sectors. He's currently president of Stanford Downtown, a business improvement district representing the major property owners, companies, and residents of that neighborhood. So much more to their backgrounds. I don't want to use our time reading biographies, so please refer to the materials. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Michelle. Okay, and thank you all for joining us. I do want to mention before you get started, I want to recognize Representative Cairns, who just joined our meeting. Thank you for joining us. All right. Michelle?
Well, thank you all for being here. I think this is a great discussion, a much anticipated topic that we all talk about. So to have your expertise and you're all in different places with your port development and to get to hear about those different stages is going to be great. I would also like to recognize Chairman Wicker, the chair of our Port Authority, and thank you for your attendance and interest today. So thank you so much for being here. I think each of our panelists have a discussion and so actual presentation and overview of their facility. So Brian, I would ask you to come up and go ahead and tell us a little bit about our esteemed North Carolina ports.
Thank you, Michelle, and again, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. It's great to meet both of you and look forward to hearing their presentations. And again, I apologize for having to depart early. I had a commitment that I need to attend to before 2 o'clock. I had hoped to be able to stay for the whole panel and learn a little bit more based on the presentation, but I'll be sure to catch up on that information. I'd like to start off the presentation, if I can get this moving. Arrow down. There we go, that moved, perfect. We were asked to put together a couple of slides, so I'm going to highlight between the ports of Wilmington and Morehead City, talk a little bit about the current operations as well as available property.
But I'd like to start our presentations off with our mission. As an agency of the state, our job is to open global gateways for our customers, to grow the volumes, and to develop the property based on the best use of that available property. So that's kind of the mindset as we move forward in some of these discussions. I'm sure the questions and answers that we'll receive today. Port of Wilmington is our largest facility. I shared some of this data before, I think at the first Towers meeting, just under 300 total acres, combined operation, where we are a landlord in some cases, we are a port operator in others. We handle all sorts of cargo between container, general cargo, bulk cargo, ro-ro, based on opportunities. We do have some available property for development, and we'll highlight those on the next couple slides. Port of Morehead City, a smaller facility, about 130 total acres. We do have Radio Island, which is about 150 acres of undeveloped property near port. The navigational features for Morehead City obviously make it extremely attractive, and I'm sure we'll talk about some of those today. Short steam time, no air draft restrictions, naturally deep channel. Both ports have about 1 million square foot of covered space where we handle cargo, and a significant amount of acreage for laydown space. I want to talk a little bit more about the property in Wilmington, and you can see a little bit of history. I won't go through it all, but the Port of Wilmington was put together over a number of years from 1951 through current, where different parcels of property were acquired. The largest was a Marriott acquisition of about 180 acres on the main port. We do have the Raleigh Street property and our north property available for development. The north property right now is undeveloped brownfield. It's waterfront access, a little over 100 acres. We've recently added about 8 acres to that. We do have a new north gate design, which accesses our current facility that will take about 10 acres of this property, as well as some additional rail siding that will be developed. But this facility is currently available for development, and we're looking for opportunities, both on the land side and the water side. And I'll wrap up with Morehead City. Obviously, the main port highlighted in yellow, a number of parcels acquired over the last 50 or 60 years. And then Radio Island totals 165 acres. And here's a close-up view of that. Part of that property is leased to the county and to the city as a public beach access. You can see part of it is used for boat access to the north of the highway. And then there is some residential development that has taken place on the north side of the island over the last number of years. There's a small parcel that is DOD property at the east end of the island, and the roadway that is a DOD road that cuts down the north property line. We do have a number of projects underway on Radio Island. We do have a port security grant that we received several years ago for rebuilding the rail infrastructure onto the island. We should be breaking ground on that shortly. And then we have an environmental impact study that's been underway for the last year. It should be wrapped up by the end of this calendar year. And that is the brief overview that we were asked to provide. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. A lot of activity going on in our North Carolina ports. Chris, I would ask you to come up and give us an overview of your Port of Virginia and facilities and what's happening there.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I really want to thank this opportunity to be here in front of you. I think it's really collaborative, and obviously down in the southeast portion of Virginia, I mean, North Carolina is, in our eyes, part of our community as well. So it's always a wonderful opportunity to come here to Raleigh and just talk about, I think, what is some real synergies and opportunities for both of our respective states and our ports to really capitalize on what is the emerging offshore wind industry. So on the screen here, I want to just kick off with a visual. Port of Virginia is really a facility made up of many private terminals. In fact, there's close to 100 private terminals within the greater Hampton Roads Harbor. But as it stands for myself, representing the Port of Virginia and the Virginia Port Authority, we operate and run 6 terminals in the Commonwealth, and 4 of those facilities reside there in the Hampton Roads Harbor. Our primary business is containers. We are the 3rd largest container shipping port on the U.S. East Coast. We are an owner and operator. We also operate and manage our facilities, as well as obviously owning the assets. And it's something that's been very healthy, obviously, for the past 24 to 36 months. Subsequently, our state has invested tremendous capital into improving port infrastructure, which has really led to how we're here around offshore wind and why PMT, which I'll get to. Just want to touch on some natural attributes on the Port of Virginia. We're very fortunate to have one of the deepest shipping channels on the entire U.S. East Coast. And in fact, we're currently dredging it to become the deepest again and widest. But I think for this industry is why we're so bullish on the opportunities around staging, load out, and manufacturing offshore wind is our limited air draft. The Port of Virginia, as we are home to the world's largest Navy base, does not have any air draft restrictions. And really that stems from the Navy and their desire to not have bridges to impact their access in and out of the harbor. Now, obviously, to the direct benefit of offshore wind, it also allows for the movement of these offshore wind turbines from the staging port out to an installation site in a fully vertical position. So we're definitely recognizing and capitalizing on that opportunity. We're transforming a legacy facility. As I mentioned, in the harbor, we have 4 terminals. 2 are container facilities. They're thriving, they're busy, and they're seeing lots of investment by the Commonwealth. We have a break bulk facility that handles a variety of freight, like ro-ro, general commodities and cargo that come out of the hull of the ship. But then we had a legacy facility called Portsmouth Marine Terminal, that at the time, in 2018, when we really began to evaluate opportunities around offshore wind and knowing that Virginia would play a role in supporting this deployment along the U.S. East Coast, we began to evaluate how we could best position this asset to not only win some business, but also support the development of a supply chain within our harbor and surrounding communities. And so over, obviously, 3 to 4 year period, and obviously through COVID, which I think added a year to a lot of these deals, we were able to strike 2 agreements at Portsmouth Marine Terminal. The first agreement we reached was with Dominion Energy. Yes, Dominion Energy is the local utility provider in the Commonwealth, the majority of the state. It is a regulated utility. They also are the developer of the largest single offshore wind project currently on the books for the East Coast. And so they leased a 72-acre footprint from the Commonwealth. We have a 10-year lease with 2 5-year options. And they're needing to invest significant capital to bring that facility up to the standard in which is required for load bearing of these heavy offshore wind objects. And then we also worked with the OEM because it definitely is an advantage to have an anchor tenant using sort of that mall concept. And Siemens Gamesa being, well, the largest manufacturer globally of offshore wind turbines, our Commonwealth was able to secure a blade finishing facility there at PMT. Both of these projects, as we speak, are currently underway in different phases of construction. So I thought I'd just put a couple photos up there. What you see on the screen is our removal process of sections of the berth there at PMT. It's a traditional marine terminal which has a load bearing capacity of 700 PSF to 1,000 PSF. Really basic stuff. Offshore wind, that's not enough, right? So we need to bolster this berth, and that's really where a lot of the construction effort is underway as we speak. In fact, we're taking major sections of the berth and replacing it and bringing the load bearing up to 2,500 PSF for the monopile delivery, and then the loadout section, which requires the heaviest loading capacity of 5,000 PSF. When this project is all said and done, we have a 72-acre footprint just adjacent high heavy strength berth that can handle multiple projects and give direct, easy access to open ocean. Look forward to the question and answer, because I think there's a lot of challenges. I don't want to take any time from David, because I think when you look at these facilities, and we're very all fortunate to have maybe existing facilities or brownfield facilities, a lot of interesting things pop up. And so I'm excited for the conversation that will come, and hopefully I can expose and create some different perspectives and give also some background on the experiences we've been dealing with in Virginia as we drive to having this facility completed in the 2024 timeframe. So thank you again.
Chris, thank you very much for that overview. One thing that I love about all of our panelists is they have vast economic development experience, and I know they bring that to these discussions as well. We are going to be now hearing from Jonathan Kennedy, and is Jonathan with us online? Do we have Jonathan?
Oh yeah, I'm in. Can you see me or hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay.
And we are working on the CU part, I think. At the very least, we're working on the CU presentation part.
Okay, great.
We appreciate your being here with us virtually, and taking the time to overview what's happening at your port. Again, I just kind of reiterate the fact that all of these panelists are in different stages of development and make their decisions based on revenue generating opportunities for their prospective ports. And so it's a good discussion to hear the similarities and the differences in each, I think. And will I just advance? Okay.
I'll jump in and maybe we can fix the video as I go. Firstly, apologies I can't be there in person, and thank you for the for the invitation to participate in this valuable, I'll say, discussion. Just to take a step back before we get into the nuts and bolts of this project. New Jersey's kind of wind story began 2018. We produced an energy master plan that commits the state to zero emissions by 2050. And really that plan made clear that without wind, frankly, we're just not going to be able to deliver on that 2050 target. So that plan kind of established, the need for wind to do some of the heavy lifting alongside solar to get us to zero emissions by 2050. A series of executive orders since then has committed the state to a pipeline, an offshore wind pipeline of 11 gigawatts, which I think is the largest pipeline on the East Coast currently. So that's the context of this project. In terms of the project itself, this is the first greenfield wind port in the US, and the distinction there, to explain what we mean, unfortunately I listened attentively to the preceding speaker. We didn't have the luxury of an existing port that was fit for purpose. We have the busiest port in the US and in the port of Newark Elizabeth, but it's a container port, and every inch of that port is utilised for container freight. So we just didn't have a port we could repurpose. We had to build a new one from scratch, which is both a good thing and a bad thing. It's purpose-built for wind. I guess to that point, this port will only ever provide services for offshore wind. There's no container, there's no conventional break bulk. This is 100% designed, built and operated just for wind. It's about 220 acres in its entirety, and that allows us to, a bit like the Port of Virginia, to have co-location, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, on the panel discussion in depth, but it allows us to have both marshalling capacity and manufacturing, side by side, right? So you can literally make these components, wheel them out the factory gates, and straight onto a jacket vessel. It's entirely state funded for now. We've secured 623 million, or just over 623 million for the port thus far. Obviously, we will need more, but for now it's entirely state-funded finance, which again is helpful from a schedule perspective, because we don't have some of those things that federal funding comes with that can slow you down. In its entirety, it's about 1,500 jobs ongoing. That's the goal. $500 million increase in GDP. If we could just scroll down to the next slide, I'll get through these quicker. Apologies. This is kind of a helicopter view. What you're looking at here is, to speak to that co-location aspect. This port at full scale will have 2 marshalling ports, so roughly 70 acres of marshalling capacity, and duplicate wharfage. So you'll be able to marshal for 2 projects simultaneously, and 3 Tier 1 component manufacturing parcels adjacent to those 2 marshalling parcels. So 5 parcels, 3 manufacturing, 2 marshalling. About a 7-year build out. Parcel A, you can see there, the first marshalling parcel, which is a 1,400 linear feet wharf, 6,200 PSF. That's about 40% complete, and that's due to complete in April 2024. The balance of the port, the other 6 parcels, will come online somewhere between 25 and 2027. Next slide, please. In terms of the commercial pictures, we have 2 tenants locked in, 2 developer tenants, Orsted for their Ocean Wind 1 project, and Atlantic Shores for their Atlantic Shores 1 project. And we're talking with manufacturers, but currently, we've only announced the developer tenants we've locked in. And I will say, the intent for this port, it's a bit like a parking lot. You know, the intent is to get a developer in, marshal for a project, get them out, get the next one in. You know, we're not looking for developers to lock this thing up for long periods. We want to get them in and get them out as quickly as possible. The next slide, please. Just very quickly, you know, this is the state's signature investment in offshore wind, undoubtedly. But it isn't the only investment we're making, and in fact we're making a series of investments in other ports. You know, we have a saying in the UK, horses for courses, basically means different ports have different uses, and recognising that we're investing in, say, manufacturing ports, O&M ports, conventional bulk ports, you know, marshalling ports, etc. So think of the wind port as part of a network of ports that collectively form a marine highway. And are mutually reinforcing assets. And I think that's it, so thank you for your attention. I look forward to the discussion.
Jonathan, thank you very much. Very informative on how you're building out. I'm seeing a theme here and a lot of container traffic in these ports, so it's going to be interesting to talk about why the case for offshore wind with a busy container industry. David, we talked a little bit about that last night at your port, but look forward to hearing from you now.
Great, thank you, Michelle. Thank you, everyone, for the opportunity to join you here. I'm David Corus, and I think, as you heard from my background, you're probably wondering why I'm here with urban design, sustainability, resilience. I'm not a staff member of the Port Authority. I am the voluntary board chair, and I've been in that position for the last 4 years or so. Previously was Deputy Commissioner of Economic Development for the state of Connecticut, and so to that end, you can see we have a strong relationship between utilizing our coastal infrastructure for economic development. We have a very, very different set of conditions than I think you've heard from my colleagues here. I would almost sort of characterize Connecticut relative to these other states as sort of artisanal in the port world. We are obviously a very small state. We have a lot of coastline, but much of it is developed over several centuries. Much of it's residential and mixed use. We only have 3 ports that we consider deep water, Bridgeport, New Haven, and New London. They have very different characters. Bridgeport has not really seen cargo activity for decades, has not been dredged since the 60s. It is much more of a recreational, mixed-use development port. But to give you a sense of how we think of that, just as our colleague from New Jersey was describing within offshore wind, that would be an O&M port and a base of operations for Vineyard Wind and Park City Wind. New Haven is home heating oil, petrol, and break bulk. Every square inch of capacity is utilized. We do not have a container port in the state of Connecticut. New London, where we focused our energy, is the only facility that is owned by the state of Connecticut, by the Port Authority. It's these 2 historic finger piers. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is mostly New London. You may know it because of the sub-base, the Naval Sub-Base, the Coast Guard Academy, and electric boat sub-manufacturing. And so there's obviously a very consistent federal dredge activity, no draft restrictions, no horizontal restrictions, and a very close proximity to the lease areas off of the South Fork of Long Island. 2 little historical notes just to make sure everyone knows context. So New London is on the Thames River, and you probably wonder why we call it the Thames and not the Thames. It is because it was named before King George and his Germanic accent mispronounced the Thames in England as the Thames, and so we retain the original pronunciation. And you've all heard of Benedict Arnold, right? Very famous trader. It wasn't until relatively recently that I knew what got him that distinction. It was for giving over the plans to New London Harbor to the British so that they could navigate in. So New London has a long and storied history. It is a very small community. It's one of our smallest municipalities. When we talk about the acreage, New London is basically the size of some of these ports. It's under 10 square miles. Not a lot of land activity. we had a facility, and you talk about sort of competing demands and competing interests, very relatively little activity, some break bulk, lumber, copper, steel coil, salt. And what was really interesting in terms of how we even got to wind was sort of a confluence of events. In 2018, the Port Authority, we are an owner, not an operator, needed to identify a new concessionaire to run this facility. And so we put out an RFP at that time and telegraphed to the marketplace, we know offshore wind is kind of starting to bubble up. Come in with a proposal if you think you can do something here or not. And some people proposed just wind, some people proposed just cargo, and some people said we could do either and we're willing to discuss. We ended up selecting who we thought would be the best terminal operator under any scenario, Gateway Terminals owned by Instructure, but they brought with them to the table Ørsted and Eversource and their partnership in Northeast Energy Offshore. And so we entered into, in 2019, a concession agreement with Gateway, which we knew would govern the facility regardless of whether or not we opted to proceed with the wind scenario. And then transitioned into a conversation with Ørsted Eversource around a harbor development agreement to determine whether or not that was advantageous to us. Ultimately, we did execute that agreement in early 2020, and it involves a conversion of the facility from these two older finger piers and very constrained upland area. Again, we're very land constrained with capacity of under 1,000 pounds per square foot to a larger facility, a minimum of 3,000 and 2 heavy lift pads. What's really interesting about this is, compared to I think some of the other conversations in other states, we in some ways have given up the facility in its entirety to wind, and we have displaced those other activities. But on the other hand, it is not a wind-specific plan. We have feasibility studies, engineering studies going back several decades that called for the kinds of improvements that we're doing. Added upland capacity, filled in areas of berths that were not necessary, increased heavy lift capacity. And those plans consistently said two things. Don't do this until you have a private investment partner who's going to defray some of that capital cost, and don't do this until you have a guaranteed user. And so what wind presented to us was those two conditions. This is about a $250 million project. I'll talk about the status in a second. That is 70% paid for by the state of Connecticut and 30% paid for by Ørsted and Eversource. And then they will pay us a below market rate, admittedly, given that capital contribution, for the privilege to utilize it for the next 10 years. And it's our expectation that during some of that time, they may not have an active wind campaign, in which time Gateway is enabled to shift temporarily to cargo activities, or we may sublease it to other wind developers. And so far, I think, again, different maybe to some of the other conditions, we are not anticipating tier 1 manufacturing. We do not have the land for that. So we are exclusively focused on tier 2, tier 3, things that want to be along the rail corridor, things that want to be barge accessible, things that want to be on the highways in relatively close proximity to the Port of New London. But we knew that the port was a mechanism for us to punch above our weight, independent of our power purchase agreements. Connecticut's power needs are not anything in comparison to New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts. So we always knew that that couldn't be the exclusive driver of our economic development impact of offshore wind. So the 4 projects that are guaranteed to come out of the Port of New London over the next several years will ultimately deliver power for New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New York. And so the port is a way for us to play in a regional market and fill a niche for us that complements what our neighbors will do and hopefully result in some economic activity within Connecticut that we might not otherwise have. What's very exciting for us is where we are. I think we've come quite a long way from executing a harbor development agreement in February of 2020 to today, again, through COVID, as well as you heard from my colleagues. The first phase of the facility, the first berth, will be finished in 2 months. the rest of the facility in about 6 months. The first turbines, the first nacelles and towers and blades will be delivered in May. That first project is a barge feeder service, but in January of 2024, the first American-made wind installation vessel, the Charybdis, being manufactured by Dominion in Texas, will be operating out of New London for the next several wind farms. And so
That's getting big, come on.
we are very excited to be hosting Charybdis. And so, you know, when Secretary Granholm came to visit the site a few months back and talked about how this is a model for the country, you know, we see, as you all do, all these complementary activities that will be occurring. We are small in our power purchase agreement, we are small in our geography, and we are incredibly small in our land availability, but the port has been a way for us to not only achieve an outsized role within this industry, we think and we hope, but leverage wind to create infrastructure investment that has lasting multi-generational value that we would not have been able to do or had, frankly, the political wherewithal to do, but for the catalyst that wind provides. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for that overview of your report. And let's just dive right in. First, I'm going to just talk about or ask a general question for all of you to kind of enlighten us, and then Brian, I may ask you some specific questions about the Radio Island site, and we'll get into that as time is of the essence. But we talked to 3 different ports here, and hello, Jonathan, we can see you now clearly, so welcome. And you talked
Michelle, before you dive in, I just want to note, Brian has to leave in 15 minutes, or 14 minutes now, so however you want to prioritize.
So dive right in, Brian. Here's looking at you, Brian. Are you ready? You're in the hot seat. So. No, obviously we've talked a lot about the Radio Island site. You have your environmental impact study that you're doing. A lot of interest in Radio Island. Can you tell us a little bit more about the site, maybe what the plans are for the site, what you see as highest and best use, and what activities are, that you can talk to us about are happening around maybe wind and wind discussions, manufacturing?
Jumping right into the questions.
Let's do it.
Excellent. So, I shared a little bit before about Radio Island. Obviously, everybody's quite familiar with it. I think I've had about 4 or 5 conversations since I arrived at 9 o'clock this morning about Radio Island, so I know it's first and foremost in everybody's mind. It is a great, obviously a great property that the port has the access to. It's got natural characteristics, as I mentioned. It's 4 miles from open ocean. It's got a 45-foot channel, and it's got no air drift restrictions. It's been a parcel of undeveloped land, obviously since the beginning, 70 years since we've owned that property. And so it's got great opportunity, it's got great challenges as well. And I think that as we move forward in potential development, it's something to keep in mind. There is residential development, there's, as I said, a leased public beach access. So we want to be aware as we move forward and work with our partners and stakeholders throughout the state that we're mindful of the local community, we're mindful of the development opportunities, that there's a great economic opportunity to support any sort of investment that's required to build out the facility. And so that's kind of the backdrop of how we evaluate opportunities, working alongside Commerce City, ENC, and those other stakeholders that bring these opportunities forward.
A lot of stakeholders have gotten used to that site being vacant for a long period of time, so there will, I'm sure, be a lot of outreach.
Yep.
Can you talk to us a little bit about the scope of your environmental impact study and what you kind of envision for the site?
Sure. So it's a public document. We've laid out a couple of different opportunities, keeping Radio Island as a multi-purpose facility, one that could support offshore wind, one that could support RoRo, and potentially the auto industry. Mm-hmm. And so it was a full build out of the 150 acres. Obviously minimal development from a warehouse or processing facility, but I think it included about a 50,000 square foot general facility general warehouse facility. 2 separate berths, one obviously capable of supporting offshore wind with the higher loads that are required, and then one that would potentially support RoRo operation based on some existing pier infrastructure that's in place to support the tank farms there. So,
I think I already know partially the answer to this, but what would need to happen to move that forward if an offshore wind manufacturer or OEM, tier 1, 2, 3, came to you and said, and I know you had some discussions, I'm sure, with some of these folks. What needs to happen to move the needle to actually get closer to an MOU or an announcement, if you will?
That's a great question. That's, you know, I think the presentations that we received today kind of paint that roadmap going forward. I mean, there is obviously vested partners in each of these projects, whether it's from the actual offshore wind developers, whether it's from power purchase agreements, whether it's from, you know, tier 1 suppliers. So I think these are great examples that we, you know, can use as we look to move forward in potential development of Radio Island.
Absolutely, and one question I do want to ask, because I want to make sure that you're here for that discussion as well, is so 3 of our ports, including our North Carolina part, are very busy with cargo operations, and you have opportunity, you know, to expand in all different areas of revenue. So why offshore wind? You know, I'm just curious, and I'd ask any of you, especially the ones with the heavy, you know, cargo activity, why offshore wind when you have other revenue opportunities? Why make an investment in something that still seems kind of far out, at least to us in North Carolina? We feel like we're in the early stage, and I know I was excited to find out from you that really it's not that far down the road, but why, you know, I'll start with you, Chris. Why, with the busy cargo port, would you make this investment in offshore wind?
I appreciate that. It's a great question, and it's one that, you know, we field quite often. Ultimately, when we take a look at the entire harbor and the workforce that comprises Virginia, and especially the Hampton Roads area, we have such a rich history in the maritime workforce. And then to be so fortunate to really have a facility at the time we could kind of consider was underutilized. And in passage of some legislation within the Commonwealth, the Virginia Clean Economy Act, there really began to be a pathway on how Virginia was going to stand up and allow for offshore wind development to take place by Dominion Energy. So you start looking at various factors, the existing sort of economy and strengths of what we provide as a community. It was really something we took a really hard look at. And also, I mean, we were able to structure an agreement that I think all parties came out winners, and that includes the Commonwealth, and that we by no means as a Port Authority you know, put itself in a position where we weren't going to be able to provide our opportunities for labor to work on that waterfront and to continue to provide jobs for our partners there. So it's something that really just kind of made sense based on what we saw policy-wise, and then obviously the unique aspects of having underutilized 270-acre footprint.
Brian, I'm going to put you on the spot again. With the busy container port and other operations, what is appealing to the port about the business opportunities for offshore?
Sure. I think it's much of the same. It's opportunities to create jobs, opportunity to create investment, to support, obviously, the targets that the state has established. We have in both ports available property that could support different segments of the offshore wind industry. Clearly, Radio Island and Morehead City, I think, has been more attractive based on those natural characteristics. And so it allows for an opportunity to support each stage of a offshore wind development. And I think it's important as we look at investing and growing our business altogether.
Very, very helpful. Thank you for that. Jonathan, did you want to talk a little bit about your decision to engage in offshore wind, understanding the other nature of your operations?
Yeah, very happy to. You know, as kind of alluded to in my opening, you know, we worked out pretty quickly, as I'm sure of other states, that, you know, you can't meet your energy targets without offshore wind. You can't have offshore wind without fit-for-purpose ports. You know, put differently, if we didn't solve this, there would be no wind, right? You can't assume other states are going to solve it for you. So really there was a non-negotiable need to solve the shortage in fit-for-purpose port capacity. Really the equation we had was, what's the most cost-effective, what's the most economically beneficial way to solve that problem? And how we thought through that equation was really no different to how we think it through for any other infrastructure investment, be that a hospital, a road, a school, a corrective services facility. You know, ultimately you're trying to work out, you know, what's the cost-benefit analysis of the project. By that we mean what's the job and GDP impact of the investment. We did an NPV analysis, so what's the financial return on the asset, and then, you know, ultimately we assessed, you know, the return in terms of jobs, in terms of, you know, supply chain attraction, etc. So really our kind of problem was, our task rather was, we need to solve it. How do we solve it in a way at least cost and with maximum jobs? And that's how we ended up with this particular port configuration in this particular location on this particular schedule with this particular funding mechanism, because federal funding is great and there's a lot of it. The problem with it is it slows you down significantly, and we had a very hard target to get this port up and running by April 2024, and if we'd kind of taken our time and tried to do a private finance or we tried to get some federal funds, we'd still be in the permitting stage. Instead, we're 40% complete on the first 30 acres. So it was that combination of non-negotiable need, thorough economic and financial viability assessment to determine best solution to solve that problem, and then the financing solution in this case was driven by the schedule, which was that we had to get this thing up and running April 2024. And that's where this port and wind ports, where government's the developer, differ from other types of public capital projects, in that if you're building a road, if you're building a school, a hospital, it matters that you deliver it on time, but you don't necessarily have private off-takers depending on the government to deliver that asset on time, with huge consequences if you're late, right? The cost of these vessels, the cost of labour, the cost of equipment. The developers and the OEMs need to know exactly when the port will be available, and if it's late by a day, a week, a month, it's significant cost to them. So this is a challenge for government. When government decides to do these projects, it is a challenge for that reason, that you have this private sector off-taker depending on it, with consequence if you don't deliver, and trying to deliver projects as a public authority. Naturally, there's challenges, processes, procedures that don't exist necessarily in the private sector. So saying all that, we're confident that that can still be done. We're actually on track to have this first piece built on time, on budget. So so far so good.
Thank you for that. So how do your ports generate revenue? And if it's based on the number of port movements, how have you balanced that with opportunities in offshore wind, which typically involve fewer movements? Is this, is the appeal the investment, or is the long-term revenue? I mean, is it a little bit of a leap of faith in the beginning, or who would like to kind of tackle that? And I know, Brian, you just have a few more minutes, so we'll just kind of tackle that, and if you have any parting words you would like to add.
John, I mean, obviously we're early in the process discussing offshore wind, but from our standpoint, commercial agreements with whether they're vessel operators or cargo interests is how we generate our revenue, how we reinvest in the port facilities. And I think something unique with the offshore wind, and these gentlemen are probably better suited to respond to it, but I think one of the unique opportunities is each of the phases of the process are fairly short, and with the right investment, there's a potential for development of an asset that can be then utilized as part of a operating port in the near future. So.
Sure, that's a good question, and I think we look at multiple approaches here. I mean, granted, there is a rental concession for the revenue tied to use of the terminal. The port, we are sort of vertically integrated in that we actually do the stevedoring as well as manage the labor. And so it's by all intent they'll be participating in the movement. And then thirdly, having the anchor tenant is also an aspect that's going to prove to be beneficial. And as those wind turbine blades are staged, moved about, and loaded to support other projects along the U.S. East Coast, again, that'll incorporate the labor there within our port. Of course, the dockage and the wharfage and the fees associated with bringing in the vessels is a revenue stream we will capitalize on as well. But really, when you stand back and look at it, it is truly that new sort of industry around offshore wind and really establishing a new economic engine or cluster within the harbor. And so that's really where we see a tremendous value, not just solely for the Virginia Port Authority, but for our host locality of Portsmouth and then the greater region and state with these really high-paying, sustainable jobs for many years to come.
So the the decision was much easier for us, without being a container point and with very limited cargo activity. We actually see the volume going up with wind, and as I said, the ability to leverage it for a capital investment to defray the state's costs in upgrading our facility was huge. So we see, we've got $80 million from the private sector to invest in our facility that we'll own for generations, and we see the annual revenue being far in excess of what we have or we're projecting from this facility. And then the capital investment opens up a breadth of opportunity in the future that will probably be lower revenue than wind, but higher than anything we had previously.
Great, and Jonathan, did you want to touch on anything there? You kind of outlined, I think, some of that in your previous answer. Brian, thank you so much for being here today, and great information, very helpful. So Jonathan, we were talking a little bit about how your port generates revenue and how the offshore wind piece fits into that when it's typically maybe fewer moves, if that's how you generate your revenue.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Oh, okay, sorry. Yeah, so I think to go back to your question about revenue and jobs, and I think for EDA, it's jobs first, kind of revenue second, right? In that, we're not building this port to make a big profit. We're not a for-profit business. Our job is to create jobs, is to create GDP impact. So, the aim of the game here for us is to build the port at lowest cost to get taxpayers their money back. If we can get more than our money back, great. But again, we're not going to prioritise profit for jobs. So the goal really for us is kind of getting that capital repaid that we're deploying. And how we do that, principally it's through rents, it's through lease fees. I think our philosophy with wind and with wind ports has been, not to say this is necessarily better than a different approach that states that are choosing. It's just the approach we took, which is you could say to industry, you have to go and solve the port problem. You have to go and build a wind farm and also solve the fact that there's not a port that's fit for purpose. Now, they will do that, but the cost of capital that they bring to that, the risks that they're going to have to deal with, that's going to be expensive for them to deal with. It's going to be complex. It's going to be high risk. We took the view that solving the port problem for them was in everyone's interests. That we could use our lower cost of capital, we could use our delivery capability. We took that off the table as something that the developers had to solve for, and therefore we think we can, charge a good rate, if you will, a good rent, because they're not having to put capital in, they're not having to take any development risk. We're solving all of that for them. They're just turning up, the port's there, they hand the keys back when they leave. So that's the philosophy behind our revenue model for the port.
Thank you for that. So you all seem to be very forward-thinking in your, ideas for going out and capturing this industry, but it would be interesting to know who led those efforts. Like, who were your champions and who led your port's involvement in the offshore wind, opportunities, and what role is your board or leadership, executive leadership taken in helping formulate these decisions?
Sure. I'll kick it off. I'll start this way and work our. I think it really comes back to when we look at the entire complex in Virginia, going back to about 2014, 2015, our leadership took a really disciplined approach of looking at the entire business and realizing there were areas of improvement that could be implemented in the container business. So we're very fortunate in Virginia. Brian's old employer, APM Terminals, had developed a semi-automated container handling facility within our harbor back in the early 2000s. The Port of Virginia actually now leases that facility from another third party, but we were able to really replicate some technology and automation through investments by the Commonwealth under the McAuliffe administration to allow for us to add extra capacity. Because without the added capacity in our core business, it really would have never enabled us to open up the Portsmouth Marine Terminal. So subsequently, as a result of those pretty strong and wise investments to add capacity through automation, there was, under the McAuliffe administration, Virginia, and really it starts under Governor McDonald, we, at the Commonwealth, wind was something 10, 15 years ago, was on the horizon, not knowing to what extent offshore wind would come. But it was something the Commonwealth was engaged with. The Department of Energy, at the time, the Department of Mines and Mineral Energy, was plugged into. And so as it sort of began to gain steam, a second time go around, Virginia had a research lease, which in fact, I didn't make this plug yet, but the only 2 wind turbines in federal waters are off the coast of Virginia. And that's something that is pretty awesome, and that just demonstrates sort of the forward thinking. So it really was led by multiple administrations, and obviously different parties, but it had momentum, and it really got jump-started through McAuliffe and on to Governor Northam, and it's continued as we move forward into Governor Youngkin. So I give kudos to a former colleague who's in the room, Jennifer Palestrin. I'd be remiss if I didn't thank Jennifer publicly for a lot of her efforts in supporting what we've done and what we've seen come to fruition during her time as a Deputy Secretary there in the Department of Energy. So it's a team approach. We have a joke, we're the Wind Avengers. There's a number of us. Jennifer's still part of that Wind Avengers group, but ultimately we saw the opportunity to really establish a new industry cluster, and that's all states. Economic development is so critical, and finding jobs, good paying, sustainable jobs, and this was something that I think Virginia really saw within the offshore wind and the supply chain that we could capitalize. And so there's been a lot of effort, a lot of leadership, and we're now seeing proven results. So it's by all means been a team approach, but one that's taken many years to get here.
So for us, we have a long history between, across a couple of gubernatorial administrations and throughout the legislature in a bipartisan way for renewable power. We have a long-standing renewable power portfolio standard with specific targets for offshore wind that go back several years. The Department of Energy and Environmental Protection were merged about 10 years ago, which created a much more robust focus on renewable generation within the Energy Department. But in terms of kind of trying to leverage offshore wind for economic development or for kind of corollary impact within the state, it's really been the Port Authority. And I think the way that I would describe it, the authority was created, spun out of the Department of Transportation just 8 years ago. And not being an operator authority and only having one property, I might say that we were kind of a little rudderless in trying to figure out exactly what our role was, right? We invest in infrastructure, we support dozens of working harbors, we have a marketing and sort of approach, but it wasn't really clear exactly what the authority's niche was. And the opportunity to kind of dive into wind, to leverage that, to upgrade our only facility, really was a huge opportunity for us as an authority as well to sort of define what it is that we wanted to focus on and advance. Now that the port infrastructure is advancing, now we see subsequently, something like the great work that you're all doing in bringing together workforce development and communications and economic development. But for us, really, the port infrastructure was the tip of the spear, and now we're building in the rest of the portfolio.
Thank you. I know, Jonathan, again, you talked a little bit about the leadership aspect on this front, but who are your champions there, and how did this come to be, and who is leading this group?
Ultimately, this is Governor Murphy, his leadership on the issue. So I think from when he started his first term, he made this a kind of defining part of his administration, of his legacy. So we've been fortunate here in terms of we've had that top-down leadership on wind, and a whole-of-government approach was followed, right? So the governor kind of set the objectives, he backed that with an energy master plan, 3 executive orders. Again, we've got an 11 gigawatt pipeline now, the largest of any East Coast state. So we have the pipeline, which is important because industry needs to know that the goalposts aren't going to move. So you need to kind of set the goalposts and keep them there, and that's very important to confidence, to investment, to attracting investment. into the state. So we've had the good fortune of that. We've had political policy stability on the issue. And I think the other aspect of this is, I mentioned whole of government. There's the focus of this discussion, I think, rightly, is ports. That's the most tangible supply chain bottleneck, if you will, alongside perhaps vessels that we see, and maybe transmission grid. But there's also a human capital side to this, and challenge that we have to overcome with offshore wind. And what we've done here in New Jersey is we've through that whole of government approach, we've had the development of ports occurring hand in hand with policies, programs, grants focused on skills and workforce, so that we're not just focused on building these assets and then finding out where we're going to get the folks to work on these assets, to do the marshalling, to work in these supply chain factories, etc. So you need to kind of solve for the assets, hand in hand with solving for the human capital piece. And really, those two things, two sides of the same coin in that respect.
I think that's such an important point. We get excited about the opportunity to create these high-paying, sustainable jobs in what are sometimes the coastal communities that are more hospitality service driven, but yet we do need to consider that we have to train that workforce. But I know in North Carolina we're really having a lot of those conversations and talking about that every day, so that's a good thing, but a very good point. I'm curious what your biggest barriers have been to making investments in offshore wind at your port. How do you overcome those barriers?
Well, again, you have to develop a payback period in trying to commit the needed capital. It is an expensive undertaking in redeveloping or building a greenfield facility. It definitely, that can be daunting, to say the least. But ultimately, having the leadership and the long-term view on what a payback period looks like, what that return is going to be for the entire community, it really allows you to see a pathway and see the momentum. And we continue to see that. I know there's been mentions of different grants that are out there at the federal level. We were fortunate enough to be awarded one of the first PID grants for a wind type of project, and those 20-some million, I think it's 21 million to be exact, are going towards the Dominion loadout berth. And so, those funds are very helpful in helping a complete package of funding to bring, what is going to be hundreds of millions of dollars invested in an existing terminal just to bring it up to the necessary standard and capacity to serve the offshore wind industry. And then one final thing, it isn't a single project play. And I think that, just like as a port, we compete with other ports on the U.S. East Coast. There are markets that we compete for. And this is a market that, our organization feels we're capable and positioned to really capture a fair amount of market share that by all means justifies the expenditure based on the term and the length of development that's here in front of us on the U.S. East Coast.
For us, I think one of the biggest challenges has just been around the nature of public-private partnerships. I think it's not something that we do too consistently within Connecticut, and it's something that there's a lot of kind of misunderstanding about. And so one thing that we have consistently had to counter is a narrative that we're investing in our port to subsidize the wind developers, rather than the way we view it, which is they are subsidizing our infrastructure that we will own and reap benefits from for decades. And so, it's very atypical, I think, for a lot of the reasons that we've discussed, that it's easier for government to go alone. We opted to go hand in hand, and from the public standpoint, that is oftentimes, there's suspicion around that. But I think it's been incredibly valuable, and it's certainly helped us, on that exponential learning curve around the industry by being so intimately engaged. We talk to the developers on a daily basis, which we probably wouldn't be doing if it was just turnkey, if we said, okay, check in with us once a month and make sure we're on track. So I think it's been incredibly beneficial, but it's something that it's difficult for the public to, sometimes view.
Jonathan, barriers to investment, or?
Yeah, I wouldn't frame it as a barrier to investment, a challenge perhaps that comes with the investment. One is, we're designing and building these ports for things that are still evolving, right? For things that are still fluid. And that's a challenge. Imagine building an airport and, airplane models are changing every couple of years. The plane shapes and sizes and technologies are changing. It would be hard to do. And that's kind of what we're having to do with wind. So, we're at 15 megawatts now. There's talk of 18, 20 megawatts. Installation methodologies will go from fixed bottom to floating. Technologies are going to change. The vessel types are changing. There's a big question right now as to whether there's going to be enough jack-up vessels or whether there'll be feeder barge methodology, and that has implications for your wharf, your dredge pockets. So one of the challenges here is kind of a technical one, which is you need to design and build your port in a way that doesn't lock out. You need to future-proof, but not gold plate, and that's the challenge, right? You need to kind of build such that you can accommodate technological change. Let's say turbine size is increasing, but not overbuild, so that you're faced with a situation where you've built something to 8,000 PSF and actually you only needed 6,000 PSF. So that's a challenge. I'll be honest, and I think you just have to. You have to kind of, how do you solve that? You just have to get good advice. You need to be really engaging with the industry as to where they see things heading, vessels, sizes, technologies, installation methodologies, etc. And ultimately, you just need to be decisive, right? You just need to pick and stick around a set of assumptions, or you would never move the project forward on schedule. So that's definitely a challenge. I think the other challenge we're experiencing as an industry is just, there's near-term turbulence. I think that's self-evident. But that's all it is, in our opinion, near-term turbulence. And we have to remember that we're building these assets for 50, 70, 100 years. And, what may or may not be happening in year 1, 2, and 3 shouldn't change the fundamental investment proposition for something that's a 50 to 70-year investment. So you kind of need to hold your nerve and understand that supply chain volatility that we're seeing and all of these problems we're seeing, in our view, it's just near-term turbulence. The fundamentals of offshore wind in the US are unchanged. Without wind, we won't hit our energy targets. Therefore, we have the confidence to proceed and to invest significant amounts of public capital into the project. That is a challenge, because you have to obviously explain to stakeholders along the way why that fundamental business case, why that fundamental investment proposition is unchanged, given some of that near-term, attention in the media and volatility that we're seeing with supply chains. So I'd probably say those two things are the biggest challenges rather than barriers.
I love that, Jonathan, that you have to hold your nerve. I think that I'm sure you have up days and days where you wonder what the heck. But I like that, you have to hold your nerve. Curious how you marketed your sites for offshore wind. I know, David, you talked a little bit about how it came to your port, but was it this, decision to, okay, let's go market this, or was it just kind of evolve with developers, or kind of how did you market your sites, and how did this come to be from that perspective?
Yeah, for us, the timing was just fortuitous. We happened to be going out for a concession agreement in 18. If we had gone out in 17, we probably wouldn't have mentioned wind, and it probably wouldn't have happened. The fact that we were going out in 18, right when the state was doing its first procurement, so we knew it was on the horizon, we were able to actually just, might have only been a couple sentences in the RFP that said, hey, just FYI, we recognize wind could fit here, so you should know we're open to proposals that contemplate that. And that opened the door. Some proposals didn't include it, some did. We picked the one that we knew would be best for us without wind, or present an interesting opportunity with. And then we entered into those subsequent conversations, and it just kept proving out to be the right decision, analysis after analysis. But I honestly, you know, either our concession agreement would have lasted until 22 and we would have missed the opportunity. It could have come up in 16 or 17, as I said, and we wouldn't have been open to it. It was kind of lucky.
And you said your first blade is going to deploy next year, 2024?
No, 23. So yeah, so the first vessel. So Ørsted is the developer. Siemens Gamesa is the provider. The first vessel with blades, tower sections, and nacelles will arrive in May.
So I think sometimes we think about this as a very long process and we've got time, but your process was not that lengthy.
Not lengthy and incredibly fast. I mean, we didn't go through NEPA because we weren't asking for federal money. The fact that we went from a harbor development agreement in February of 2020 to an operational facility in April of 23, I mean, that is, I think, remarkable for a $250 million publicly managed infrastructure project. And to Jonathan's earlier point, you know, if we didn't have our private partner talking to us every day and reiterating, you know, how they're the ones on the line to the state of New York to have that power being delivered, and so that creates an impetus for us. And by the way, there are penalties for us too, right? I mean, there's all kinds of incentives, both positive and negative, that make sure that we stay on task. But you know, we had to start a while ago, and we had to move quicker than we normally would.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mentioned earlier the 2 turbines that are off the coast of Virginia, and you know, really that is when it sort of began. At the time it was Dong Energy, now known as Ørsted. You know, when they came to us and they had secured the contractor agreement with Dominion Energy to install those 2 research turbines back in 2017. It's really when we began to field interest and inquiries. It's fair to say, obviously, Europe's ahead of us, you know, many decades in offshore wind, and many of the European developers were obviously canvassing the landscape of terminals up and down the U.S. East Coast, especially the ones without the air draft constraints. So, you know, we had a number of different discussions. At one time, we in fact, you know, had a lease with Ørsted for a portion of the terminal with optionality to it. They decided not to further execute that optionality, which has worked out fine. But with that, it sort of put Virginia on the map, and granted, with Dominion Energy having the Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind Project, and once the Virginia Clean Economy Act was passed, it really then ultimately sort of gave the alignment for Port of Virginia and Dominion to enter that agreement for the staging and load-out portion of PMT. So, you know, it helps to have a project, candidly, but ultimately it's not, as I've said earlier, it's not a single project play here. And it's an opportunity to really advance an entire industry through the Port of Virginia. So.
Jonathan, did you actively market your site, or was it happened for you a little bit differently there in New Jersey?
So we actively marketed per, you know, our statute, everything. We every property we own and tenant, we have to go through a public competitive process to select tenants. So that's a non-negotiable. I would say though that I think that the difference with our project is that we made the investment decision and began development before we'd locked in any tenants. Mm-hmm. And that was because we took a view, you know, we went through an 18-month, again, you know, economic, financial viability analysis.
We've lost. You're frozen in the middle of what I feel like was very informative. I feel like we really needed to hear that, John. While we wait for Jonathan to come back, we have about 15 more minutes, and I still have tons of questions, but I feel like maybe some of you do too. Does anyone have any questions for our panel?
One of the issues, obviously financing, initial estimates, you know, whether it's up in New England, just to get started on upgrades, and granted, depending on the size of, you know,
This meeting is being recorded. Not necessarily deal breakers. So I think the things that what was that, sorry?
Jonathan, you were frozen for quite a bit of time. I feel like you never missed a beat, which is amazing. But you were just touching on something I think we all were really interested in, is that you started to make investments before you had an actual tenant or agreement. And please don't go away. No. We want to hear this.
I just turned my video off, sorry, in case that's what's slowing the bandwidth sound. Where did you lose me? Apologies.
We lost you at this critical point where you were talking about the fact that you went ahead with investments, not necessarily having a tenant or an agreement. So can you talk to us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, happy to. So, it goes back to the process by which we made the investment decision back in 2018. We undertook a roughly 18-month in-depth process. We've got specialist financial commercial advisors, market experts, technical experts, and we worked through what does the supply-demand equation look like out to 2050. And that gave us sufficient confidence to proceed with the investment without having locked in any tenants. Because again, all the analysis shows that the demand for port capacity to 2050 will significantly outstrip supply of port capacity. So we proceeded on that basis, and we didn't necessarily link the investment decision to a particular tenant or to a particular LOI, MOU, etc. We moved first because we kind of had to because of timing, and then we solved for finding tenants.
I think that's very interesting to hear because that's a very different approach, and it's neat to see how the different approaches have all kind of worked out and have kind of the same end result. So there's no one great way or one perfect way to get there. You can achieve your results in many different ways. And you had a question. We will resume now your question.
The question is sort of technical, but
sort of technical, but it's more of a banking question. All of this is being done with borrowed money. And so states, local jurisdictions, the private sector partners, when people get started with us, the first 100 million, and then the number we heard was 600 million. So if you could go in a little bit deeper in terms of how people buying the bonds, buying your promise of the revenue stream going forward, what are some of those conversations look like more than just, well, do you have the money to pay us back? What are some of the other issues as you borrow that money? Because the state is going to borrow money, a port authority is going to borrow money. There's a lot of detail that can go into that. So just sort of curious.
Just general.
Yeah, so for us, they're not revenue bonds. They're general obligation bonds in the state of Connecticut that they then sub-allocate to us for utilization. So it is backed by the full faith and credit of the state of Connecticut. It doesn't have any relation to our future revenue streams. We obviously have projections and analysis around the return and what that future revenue stream looks like but that is not at all part of the assessment of the bond purchasers.
And very similarly, for the Commonwealth, the contribution is a $40 million split between the Dominion project and Siemens Gamesa. So from a state perspective, those are all the funds that apply to the build-out. The rest of the improvements are being funded by the users, respectfully Dominion and Siemens Gamesa.
Jonathan, did you want to weigh in on that question, or?
Yeah, happy to. So I think it was, I couldn't see, but I think it was Connecticut. All the funding and financing for this project thus far has been backed by the state, so state credit, not project credit, if you will. So bondholders are taking appropriation risk, not cash flow risk on the asset. But yeah, just to kind of zoom out a bit, I think ultimately if you assume the cost of building a port is the cost of building a port, either taxpayers pay for it or ratepayers pay for it, right? Because if the private sector is developing the port, they're getting that money back and a return somewhere. They're getting that back through the OREC process in our case, or through the the equivalent process in the state. So we shouldn't assume if taxpayers are paying to build the port that it's necessarily costing more than it would if the private sector was allowed to develop it. Again, because the private sector is going to get that money back somehow, rightly, and they'll do that through the solicitation process. So, in our view, it was better off in net terms. We were better off as a state to taxpayer fund the port than to ratepayer fund the port.
Thank you for that. Anyone from the task force have any questions for our panel? Questions? Well, I certainly do. So I'm very curious that, obviously people have very strong thoughts about this, for, against. What allies emerged that surprised you? Like, wow, I had no idea this group would be so supportive. And on the other side of that, where did you find opposition that was kind of surprising to you, or did you encounter that? David, I see you might want to take a stab at this.
I don't know if I've found the surprising ally yet. I hate to say, there are certainly allies, but I don't think it's anything that you wouldn't think of. It's all folks like you all in the room representing these stakeholder constituencies around economic development, workforce development, environmental protection, etc. I think for us, I don't want to get too bogged down in the particularities of Connecticut, but we're not a fast-growing place, right? It's very different being in a place like New England compared to the Carolinas or Colorado, where change is happening all around you, right? Change happens very slowly where we are, and so everything that is change is viewed very negatively and with a lot of suspicion. And so from our standpoint, the very, very minimal amount of cargo that was displaced from the port has gone to bolster and make the Port of New Haven even stronger, or has activated long vacant, formerly industrial sites up the Thames River. That is a very good thing for us. That is a very bad thing for all the people who live near long vacant, formerly industrial sites that are now being reactivated. And so, NIMBYism is everywhere, but I feel like in a slow-growing place like Connecticut, every little bit of change is even more pronounced in terms of the reaction.
And I can appreciate Brian alluding to the Radio Island site having been vacant for over 60 years, and people get used to that level of activity or non-activity and how they can and can't utilize the site. So I can appreciate that. Chris, any surprise allies?
Well, I'd see your perspective that I think is real interesting, and it's, I think, a dynamic that both the Hampton Roads area and Northeast North Carolina share, and that there's a heavy population within those communities that are associated with the shipyards. 2/3 of individuals in the U.S. who say, I'm a shipbuilder, they live within that MSA area. So that's Camden County, and that's all Hampton Roads, And so it's not that there's opposition, but it's that mindful approach, knowing you have a aging workforce within the shipyards, obviously providing critical work to maintain our naval fleet, and this exciting opportunity of a very similar type trade in obviously welding and fabrication of wind turbines. So I think it's been very transparent and forthcoming, an active discussion, and by no means does offshore wind and the development of this new industry within the region want to take away from the workforce that is so critical to the shipyards and is needed more and more every day. And so again, I don't know if that's opposition, but it's just been an interesting ongoing discussion, and I think at the end of the day, I think most of us who are living it feel that there is sort of a renewed level of interest within that particular trade and skill set of shipbuilding, pipe fitting, and welding, that wind is helping sort of accelerate and gain attention. Because obviously not everybody who's coming out of the CTE, out of the high schools, or into these apprentice sort of situations is want to go work offshore. Like, that's not their aptitude. They might want to be a shipyard or vice versa. So again, I don't know that we've had a huge challenge. And of course, I mean, by all means, we're going to be mindful of the cost. And that is, as Jonathan mentioned, I mean, the ratepayers and being mindful of we're a regulated utility in the Commonwealth. And so, that is something that has to be looked at, and it has been, and it is making sure that we're mindful on the cost of these projects as it does pass on to personal individuals, of course, but of course, industry and corporations throughout the state.
Thank you. Jonathan? Any surprise allies or?
Not really. Look, I mean, we've got broadly, you know, across the board support for wind and for the port. I think, look, with any major construction project, and particularly projects on the water, there's sensitivities. You know, naturally, there's going to be impacts. They have to be mitigated. You know, you need to educate and communicate how you mitigate those impacts. So at a project level, that's been a challenge, but that's a challenge for any in-water project. It's not unique to a wind port. So that's certainly a factor. In terms of kind of, you know, residential proximity and other things, that's not an issue in this particular case for us. We're actually building this wind port right next door to a nuclear power plant. Never been done before globally. And that's actually a good thing, because it means there's, you know, the nearest residential area is actually across the Delaware River. It's not even in New Jersey. So, you know, we don't have any of the local opposition concerns. In fact, the local community in our case is extremely supportive. I think, you know, someone mentioned about workforce. Because this port is remote, you know, workforce challenges, workforce requires attention to make sure we have the skills in place, you know, given that 1,500 jobs we expect to create. So there's pros and cons of location. In our case, the pros are it's remote, so there's no proximity issues, but being remote, again, has workforce challenges potentially, but that can all be overcome. So, you know, we've only seen good, strong support for the project thus far.
Well, that is fantastic. And you touched on workforce. That's kind of a passion of mine. And Chris, you brought up a point. I just want to elaborate. So all these ports, obviously, mariners, you know, and working in and around the water. We have a big commercial, you know, fishing heritage here and community and so forth. And we talk a lot in this room about, hey, our commercial fishermen can transfer right into this, you know, they can upskill and become a part of this workforce. How realistic is that really? I mean, are you seeing some of your, you know, generational families transitioning into this work? I mean, how is that workforce piece, or how are you seeing that workforce development piece evolve?
By all means, I mean, you look at, you know, anyone who comes from a family working on the waterfront, either fishing or an industrial trade. These are people that know perseverance. They also know opportunity, and so, you know, just with the CVAL research project, there's 2 turbines. I mean, there are plenty of, I would say, local or regional mariners that were able to either modify a launch boat, which happened, and cut the bow off of a launch boat so it could actually go against the tower before the crew transfer vessel had been completed, to providing just perimeter type security, because, you know, that's something that during the construction phase you need to keep the recreational folks away and other interests. So, I mean, definitely, I see, you know, especially the smaller, you know, I would say shipyards and even, you know, smaller fleets of vessels will see opportunities and niches that they're going to be able to respond to immediately, vice some of these larger enterprises that just won't be able to pivot as quickly as it's going to take. And, I mean, even to as simple as, you know, it's a tourist attraction. People now go to Virginia Beach. You can go on a tour and go see the 2 test turbines. I recommend you do it. It is really cool to see them up close. And who would have thought, you know, versus going to see the dolphins or the whales. So, I mean, I know it's just a simple, but I'm telling you that's a type of economic opportunity that I know this entire coastline is going to see. And then you overlay the recreational because of the fixed bottom. It's pretty exciting for anyone who is obviously into fishing. From a recreational perspective, I think there'll be a real boom here in the Carolinas and Virginia after these projects are built.
Yeah, ditto. You know, we have robust training going on right now between our terminal operator and the international longshoremen, as well as the local chapter, to make sure that they're ready for the movement of the components. We have a robust fishing fleet, somewhat out of New London, Groton, Stonington, but across the border there in New Bedford, and the developers are working very closely with them. Similarly, not so much necessarily, I think, to to upskill, but just to find complementary activities that they can do when they're not fishing that supplement their variable income with some, more steady sources. And then I can absolutely reiterate the tourism part. We have 5 turbines off Block Island, out on the edge of Long Island Sound. They're absolutely a tourism draw. And we're confident that, just the first day that the towers start getting stood up on the installation vessel in New London, there will absolutely be people coming from all over, Mid-Atlantic and New England just to see that.
Susie, did you have a question?
Yeah.
I know, Jonathan, you've talked quite a bit about workforce, and I appreciate you bringing that to the surface, but since we're running out of time, I'm going to go ahead and, Susie, you have a question.
Thank you. This is probably more for David than anyone, but back to your RFP process. When you put together the RFP, I'm assuming, was it in partnership with others? Was it strictly the Port Authority? But more importantly, how did you all write it in such a way that it left the flex space component? I mean, what you've described is you've made an investment now, you can use it for wind, you can not use it for wind, or variables in between. Was it consciously written that way, or was that the deal you just immediately ended up with?
Yeah, no.
And David, would you pull your microphone closer to make sure that our recording
Is that better? Yeah. So yeah, it was managed by the Port Authority, and it was deliberately done for that purpose. We had advisory services, consultant support in that effort, but it was very clear that we were looking for the highest and best use, and that could be more sort of break bulk or conventional cargo, or it could be some other niche that we either knew was kind of on the horizon, like wind, or something else. And so it was very much open-ended, but structured in a way, and I'm happy to share the RFP itself, so that when the responses came in, we could compare apples to apples, but also not have to necessarily pick one in lieu of the other. And so what ended up being the best response for us was a terminal operator who said, I am proposing to be the terminal operator to expand your conventional cargo operations, but I also am bringing to the table this wind developer who I would partner with on a wind solution if you determine that that is preferable to us operating this as conventional cargo. And the way that it was managed was basically as a two-step process. We said, you are the best respondent regardless. Let's first negotiate a concession agreement with you so that you're on board handling whatever comes through the terminal. And then once that was in place, we then started subsequent tri-party negotiations with that operator and the wind developer to see if we could come to terms on the harbor development agreement, which would temporarily pause the base concession agreement. We ultimately did, but even the way that that harbor development agreement is written and the way that it modifies the concession agreement between wind campaigns, if there is no sublessor, sublessee wind developer, the concessioner is empowered to mobilize other cargo through the facility.
Any other questions from our task force, our audience? Jeremy Tarr from the governor's office.
No, Jordan Witcher from the Department of Commerce, but our beards look like. This is maybe, Chris, best directed to you, but we'd welcome anybody's perspective. Can you talk a little bit from the port's perspective and maybe the whole offshore wind community that you've engaged with perspective, how your relationship with the Navy has gone through all of this, but sort of from a seafaring perspective and maybe from an aviation perspective? We probably have more aviation impacts in eastern North Carolina, maybe, and clearly y'all have both shipbuilding and aviation.
I appreciate that question, and it is one that we're very fortunate to have such a significant Navy presence in our harbor. In fact, we share a boundary line at one of our facilities. So being the case, we are very engaged frequently, often, many of us within the company, within the organization, on different items with the Navy. So there's constant channels, and into the, like for instance, I appreciate you mentioning the airspace. One of the projects we're kicking off here in 2023 is an optimization of the North End NIT, which is adjacent Norfolk Naval Station,
We have these ultra-large container cranes, Neo-Panamax that was described for Port of Wilmington. We have many as well. Well, those cranes sit within airspace of Chambers Field, which is part of Norfolk Naval Station. And so we've taken certain measures to design a crane with our vendor that will be under their ceiling that we have to fall under, which is 200 feet. And that's not something we really would have been cognizant of if we hadn't had that sort of been ongoing. Of course, the harbor itself, is sort of Navy, Coast Guard, pilot's port, and ultimately, when there are moves that the Navy is taking underway, certain activity in the harbor will stop or slow down. We are conducting a significant dredging project to deepen our channels and widen the channels. And that's really, for us, again, another way to continue to accommodate the needs of military movements, and that when we bring in these ultra-large container vessels, because of the width, it does restrict dual movements in and out. We are widening these channels, or we're widening the channels, which will ultimately allow for the two-way transit. So again, Virginia has been very intentional in making sure that we take the necessary steps, because it's a very open channel of conversation in the Navy and the Port Authority, so that, of course, we want them to be happy and make sure that we're not doing anything in a vacuum, so that ultimately, we're having to go back and fix it, because we don't want to impact anything around national defense. So it's communication, and we're very, very fortunate. There's great leadership there.
All right, Chris, I have a question for you. We often or generally talk about competition between ports, and with Virginia and North Carolina, along with Maryland, being members of the Smart Power MOU, which you may be familiar with, where we're collaborators, if you will, on how we advance our region in offshore wind. What, if anything, is there any opportunity for collaboration between our ports that you see?
So I think, it's like any industry, within ports authorities, we all have, either crossed paths professionally or have colleagues who have worked for one another. I mean, Brian's no different. And so we have, obviously mutual respect for one another, appreciation for what each of us is trying to accomplish for our respective harbors. And by all means, I think this is such a tremendous opportunity that lies in front of the U.S. East Coast, that there are things that certain harbors are going to be able to do better than others. And when you look at the Mid-Atlantic in particular, between the tri-party agreement with Maryland, North Carolina, and Virginia, I think each of us has a unique space that we can participate in and ultimately, I would say, exceed and excel and find those opportunities and businesses that benefit all of us. But I also think there are certain attributes in, if I'm looking at Kitty Hawk Wind, I mean, that project will ultimately, hopefully run through Sandbridge, Virginia, and interconnect there in Virginia Beach. Those are the North Carolina project, and we're excited to support it where we can and the opportunities that it presents. But I think there'll be plenty of opportunities for the waterfront users currently in North Carolina and opportunities to come along.
Still competition.
Friendly competition.
Friendly competition.
Well, I think that's all the time that we have, unless there's more questions. And Jordan, my apologies, my esteemed colleague. I get wrapped up in my own thoughts here, and my apologies for that. So lastly, I would just say, what lessons have you learned from your experience? What advice do you have for us here in North Carolina as we're forging this path? We feel like we've got great opportunity, great properties to market, and what advice do you have for us?
So I think my main piece of advice would be picking up on something that you were talking about earlier coming out of the communications subcommittee, this education campaign. It's a new industry, it's very different than anything else we've dealt with, right? We didn't used to, someone would just build the power plant and that was kind of it. It didn't have all these components that would inevitably involve multiple communities, multiple states, multiple stakeholders, and I think the more that we can help the public understand not just all the moving pieces, but the opportunities they present, the better engagement and feedback we will have. We all want public feedback to help make our projects better, but it needs to be informed. And the onus is on us to inform the public so that they can best provide us feedback that will influence our projects to the better.
I think collaboration, I made the joke of offshore wind Avengers in Virginia, but that's a real thing. I mean, there are a handful of folks within state agencies, within regional economic development groups, within associations that represent maritime interests, within the Port Authority. It takes a number of champions to get out there, be willing to answer the tough questions, and to sit down and hear the opposition, and also be able to sell it to all parties, so that there is a real, I think, win, and no pun intended there, I promise. But really, the jobs that are going to come from this new industry, matched by the capital investment, it's exciting for our waterfront, and these opportunities don't come along often. But we have something that lies in front of us that I think will provide generational opportunities for these respective communities, and obviously the opportunity for a renewable source of energy is tremendous. So I definitely think it takes a number of different champions, and even taking people out of the comfort zone, and having engagement, conversations with folks who maybe on occasion will be opposed. I can say as an industrial waterfront user, I think it was mentioned by one of the panelists, there can be opposition occasionally to working on the waterfront, but I think we try to do it in such a collaborative fashion to hear all voices that ultimately this is an exciting industry that people are jazzed about and can be done right. And so if you put those things together, I think you really have a pathway to success.
Jonathan, any parting words for us here in North Carolina? Any advice for us?
Only, I guess I'd finish with it's kind of three legs to the stool, right, if you will. There's the port, there's kind of skills, and there's pipeline. And I think you need all three, right? You can't solve for one of them without solving for the other two. They come as a package. Because again, you'll have ports without the necessary skills. You'll have skills but no ports. And if you've not got a pipeline, you're going to struggle to attract investments from the supply chain. So I think of it as kind of an integrated whole of government approach. That's certainly what we've done here with ports, the human capital and the pipeline. And by pipeline, I don't just mean pipeline within each of our states. I mean, we should be thinking about the pipeline as a whole across the East Coast. And it's about, building that pipeline and keeping that pipeline stable. That's going to be key.
Thank you. Well, this has been a fantastic discussion. Thank you for taking the time. I know it's been a time investment for you, and it's just been really interesting for us to hear how you've managed your projects and your process. So thank you so much.
Again, we want to thank Chris Gullickson, Director of Development and Transportation Policy for the Port of Virginia. Thank you, Chris, for joining us. Jonathan Kennedy, Vice President of Infrastructure for New Jersey Windport. Thank you, Jonathan. And David Corris, Chairman of the Connecticut Port Authority Board of Directors. We really appreciate you taking time and coming to share your information and experience with us, and hope that you can stay around for some continued conversation after our break. We will break now. It's 2:37. We'll break until 2:50.
This has been a lot to take in today, and I just want to mention something. So we've heard from 3 different states, other than North Carolina, that have taken existing port facilities and they are not fixing them or changing them or doing construction to convert those to facilities that can handle offshore wind industry stuff. The 2 sites that are potential sites in North Carolina are basically 2 sites that were identified that have never been developed, basically. So to develop the 2 sites that were mentioned today in North Carolina, you have to finish the environmental impact work. They've never been developed, so you're starting from scratch, so we're looking at an even longer permitting period probably than what our sister states faced when they were converting existing sites. So I can't help but wonder, and I'm just kind of throwing this out, and I'm hoping someone can answer this for me. Just how far behind are we of our sister states, and is there cause for concern? And I think I might know the answer, but I want to hear from some of my task force members or staff. they're on the move up there. And it seems like we're still in the beginning stages. Should we be concerned?
I just want to offer perspective, and I don't know that I can answer the question about concern or not concern. I think there's a distinction though that is important, and that is when you look at the New England states where there is active development, there are generally legislative mandates for the particular resource, offshore wind. We do not have a legislative mandate for offshore wind in North Carolina. And so I think it boils down to a risk-reward calculation for a lot of folks that would be in the development space. When there's a mandate, there is typically a guaranteed cost recovery vehicle or mechanism. And so it eliminates some of the risks that the development community feels. The other thing that New England generally has going for it is high electricity prices. And so the economics associated with projects is different. Now, it's striking that many of the developers, maybe not many, but a number of the developers in New England are looking to renegotiate contracts because inflation has changed their economics quite a bit, and they're not looking nearly as good from a profitability perspective in terms of development. But the two things that really I view to be important distinctions are legislative mandate and costly electricity. We have cheap electricity and no legislative mandate. So the dynamics are just different.
Is this, okay, now it's definitely working. I'll also add that I think the other really important distinction that, and forgive me for forgetting names, the gentleman from Virginia, the gentleman from Connecticut made, is that they had not only a ports operator come to them and say, this is what we want to do, but they brought a developer with them. So they not only had what he had mentioned about a set investment, a private investment already in hand, but they already also, that investment came with a user. And so there was no question as to who that user was going to be or how that was all going to work. And again, in North Carolina, we have a lot of uncertainty in the fact that we don't have, and the carbon plan is going to help to figure some of this out, but we don't know exactly how our power is going to be purchased and who's going to purchase it and how that's all going to work. We don't have power purchase agreements. And again, that's what that CRIRP process will help with when Duke Energy looks at the 3 different wind energy areas and figures out which one is the shortest cable route and the most ideal, and all of those details. And that will hopefully, again, provide certainty. But that's where we've done a lot of research in the SWC end with also bringing in those users. They're waiting for that market signal to say, this is absolutely going to happen, and we're going to put our money here. So there's a lot of moving parts, and I think that the UK delegation that visited us back in October did a really good job of kind of presenting that chicken and egg argument, and I think that's very much the position that North Carolina is in. So I hope that made sense. And to answer your question in terms of timeline, we've also done a lot of research, and I would almost beg to argue that Radio Island being undeveloped presents a lot of opportunity in a sense. Also, again, with the other port where they mentioned they were able to customize the port so much that they can transfer right into that manufacturing and roll it right off and get it where it needs to go. I know that the EIS for Radio Island looks at a multi-use facility, but I think there's an opportunity for that development to be customized for offshore wind as much as possible and make really good use of the space and the resources that are available. And also, it was mentioned earlier that a lot of those upgrades that need to happen to support offshore wind will also benefit other users of ports. And I think that's something that is going to be interesting to navigate, because we don't want to make the argument that if we're upgrading ports that, as somebody else could come in and use it instead of offshore wind. But I think that Brian made a really good point of talking about that timeline for offshore wind in the different phases, because you have the staging upgrades, manufacturing of the upper tier, and then the subcomponents and marshalling. And as offshore wind is very circular life cycle, and as you go through that life cycle, there are other industries that can benefit from using the upgrades that come along with the offshore wind upgrades. So there's a lot of pieces to that, but in terms of timeline, just for staging upgrades, we've done a lot of research based on what other ports have done, and they're talking about 3 to 7 year construction timeline. And if we're looking at Kitty Hawk is going to start construction in 2026 and Wilmington East as early as 2029, we're not behind, but we need to start ASAP.
Thank you, Kevin and Carter, for sharing those perspectives. Any other thoughts or comments, questions? We still have our panelists here who are open to answering any questions as well.
I'll just make one final comment. The other important aspect of the energy legislation that the governor signed in 2021, Peter gave us a good summary of the carbon plan, but what he didn't mention is that the legislation specifically says that the Utilities Commission, yes, there is a carbon aspiration from a reduction perspective, but there's also a least cost mandate that's part of that. Where the legislatures in New England have mandated offshore wind, generally they're saying, thou shalt go build this many megawatts of offshore wind. There's generally not that price check. Whereas here, we've got a Utilities Commission that is absolutely focused on making sure that, yes, we want to achieve decarbonization goals, and we're certainly committed to it, but you've got to do it in a way that minimizes cost pressures to customers. And so that least cost mandate still plays a pretty important role when you think about offshore wind in the context of other resources that might be available.
So the bottom line of what you're saying, Kevin, is it may not, I'm sorry, Mark, may not be offshore.
Sometimes people call me
Sometimes
Kevin.
people call you Kevin.
Yeah, it happens.
Is that the bottom line is it may not be offshore wind offering the least cost for.
I mean, but we would represent that it really isn't all of the above, right? I mean, one of the things that has made North Carolina successful from a cost perspective is not putting all of our fuel eggs in one basket, for instance. So if you look at the Midwest is still almost entirely dependent upon coal generation. They're very susceptible to cost swings in commodity markets. You look at Florida, it's natural gas. In North Carolina, over 50% of the energy we deliver to customers on our system is nuclear. But we've got, from a capacity perspective, about a third nuclear, a third natural gas, and then the balance is hydro, solar, some coal still on the system. And so that diversity of fuel helps minimize the risk that any one resource becomes a cost pressure. And so wind probably is part of that mix at some point.
Any other comments, questions, thoughts you want to share? All right, I know it's been a long day. We received a lot of great information, and while it seems we're behind where we ideally would like to be, we're probably just where we should be. And one of the advantages that we have is that we have so many partners who are willing to guide us away from mistakes that who have gone ahead of us and who navigated a way forward that we can pursue without making some of the mistakes that were made. So I really do want to commend our subcommittees for your diligence and all of the information gathering, education, sharing with communities and citizens, and of course we will continue all of those efforts. Thank you for your time today. I know this has been a long day as always, but I appreciate your commitment. Any final thoughts, any final questions before we adjourn? And for those who want to get the other pages that we're missing from there, the carbon plan report, we do have those available. And also, we have a one-pager if you have not, if you don't have a copy in your book. Just kind of summarizes what North Carolina is with offshore wind. I want to make sure everyone picks up a copy of those before you leave. Again, we thank you. We don't have our location yet for our next meeting. That will be announced soon, but stay tuned. We'll convene in May, the first week of May.
How about Italy? Good.
They do want to partner with us for offshore wind.
Good idea, Kate, I like that.
I'm sorry.
That's a good idea, Dave.
All right, thank you everyone, and wishing you safe travels as you make your way back home.